They found my predecessor's boots 3 miles deep in the forest with his feet still inside them. That was the message carved into the ranger station door when I arrived in Juneau on a Tuesday in March. Not written, carved, gouged into the wood so violently that splinters hung like accusatory fingers. The park superintendent tried to explain it away as a prank, but there were 17 parallel scratches, each one deeper than a human fingernail could manage, each one pointing north, deeper into Tlingit territory, deeper into the places where the old stories still breathed. My name is Raymond Gray. I am 60 years old, and I have spent 32 of those years managing the forests of Alaska. I have tracked moose through blizzards. I have pulled hikers from hypothermia. I have walked into places that test a person's faith in the world being rational. But I had never walked into a job where the previous ranger's boots arrived without him. The superintendent's name was Charles Sanders, 57, and he had the look of a man who knew something should have stopped him from hiring me. He sat across from my new desk in a building that smelled like mold and pine resin and something else. Something that made the back of my neck contract. The official report, Charles said, sliding a folder across the table, states that Raymond Marsh left his position of his own volition. He sent no resignation letter. He simply ceased appearing for his scheduled shifts. After 6 weeks of absence, we assumed he had abandoned the post. I did not touch the folder, but someone carried his boots back, I said. Charles did not meet my eyes. There are difficult things about this job. Things that the federal government does not acknowledge in any official capacity. Things that the Tlingit elders have tried to explain to us for generations. I assume you have heard the stories about this region. The old stories about Kushtakakia, I said. The wild man. The one that leaves claw marks on cabin walls and takes hunters who wander too far from the fire. Charles nodded slowly. The indigenous peoples of Southeast Alaska have maintained oral traditions about a creature, a guardian they call it sometimes, that inhabits these forests. They have protocols. They have taught us their protocols. We ignore them, and periodically we lose rangers. You lose rangers? 4 in the last 23 years. Officially, they either quit or got lost on hiking expeditions. Unofficially, we found pieces of them, clothing, equipment. Once, a partial remains that the coroner said could have belonged to any large animal. I stood up and walked to the window. Juneau sprawled before me in the gray light of an Alaskan morning. Buildings huddled against the forest as if the forest might decide to lean on them. Beyond the town, the trees stood in perfect rows, and beyond those rows the darkness waited. What did the Tlingit elders tell you? I asked. To respect the boundaries they have marked. To never go north of the Gastineau Channel after sundown. To leave offerings at the old stone cairns. To never, ever venture into the Salmon Lake Basin without the proper protocols, the proper words. They said Raymond Marsh ignored the markers. They said he went looking for evidence of something, some kind of anomaly in the ecosystem. That night, I drove to the ranger station 10 miles north of town. It was a small building, built in the 1980s, surrounded by a perimeter that someone had marked with stones. Small stones, perhaps the size of a fist, arranged in a spiral pattern pointing outward. There were perhaps 200 of them. Someone had reset them very recently. The earth around them was still dark with rainfall. Inside, the station was immaculate, too immaculate. I understood immediately that this was not the work of the cleaning staff. Every surface was organized, every tool hung in its precise position. Every file had been alphabetized. Someone had been here, living here, and they had been very, very careful about leaving no evidence of themselves. On the desk in the back office, I found a map. It was old, hand-drawn in pencil, and it marked territories. One entire section of forest north of the station had been divided into quadrants and labeled with a single repeated word, TLN-IC boundary. Beneath that, someone had written smaller notes. Do not enter after 1800 hours. Offer tobacco at the tree marked with 3 white stones. The creature is not hostile if protocols are observed. The handwriting was steady and educated. This had been written by someone who understood what he was writing. Someone who had reached these conclusions through careful study rather than superstition. The back door of the station opened directly into the forest. I stood in the threshold and listened. The sound of birds had stopped. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the trees were holding their breath against something worse than silence. You are the new ranger, a voice said behind me. I turned to find an elderly woman standing inside the station. She was Tlingit, perhaps 70 years old, and she wore traditional regalia, a button blanket decorated with the formline designs of her house. Her name, I would learn, was Judith Kelly. Her family had held stewardship over these lands before the federal government decided they owned them. How did you get past? I began. but she raised a hand. I have been walking these forests longer than you have been walking the earth. There are ways that are not marked on your maps. She moved to the desk and looked at the map Raymond Marsh had created. He was a good man, intelligent. He made it 7 months before his curiosity became more powerful than his caution. What did he find? I asked. He did not find it. It found him. That is the difference, and it is the most important difference. The creature in these forests is old. It was here when my people arrived. It was here when the glaciers retreated. It is tied to this place in ways that your government would call supernatural and my people simply call natural. It has territories. It has protocols. It has decided what it will permit and what it will not. And what did Raymond Marsh permit? He went to the nesting site. There is a valley 3 miles north where the snow stays year-round even in summer. There are structures there, old structures. He wanted to document them. He wanted to prove something. He thought he could go during daylight, take photographs, and return before sunset. He did not understand that the creature operates on its own schedule, not ours. That its protection is not restricted to the hours of darkness. Judith Kelly left as mysteriously as she had arrived, disappearing into the tree line while I stood frozen at the desk. But before she left, she placed something on the map. A small carved object, perhaps 2 inches long, made from bone or antler. It was a representation of a human figure, but the proportions were wrong. The shoulders were too broad, the arms extended too far. The head was tilted back as if in mid-howl. I did not sleep that first night. Instead, I read everything in the ranger station's files. I found Raymond Marsh's personal notes tucked behind a loose panel in the equipment room. 23 pages of careful observations. His first entries were mundane. March 14th, moose population showing increased activity in Sector 4. March 18th, hiking trails require maintenance on the East Ridge. April 2nd, Indigenous liaison Judith Kelly brought traditional knowledge regarding territorial markers in northern sectors, but the entries grew darker as the months progressed. May 23rd, found unusual structures in the Salmon Lake Basin. Geometric arrangements of stones, some carved with symbols resembling formline art. Too deliberate to be natural. Tlingit connection requires investigation. June 8th, retrieved rock samples from the basin. Composition includes materials not native to Southeast Alaska, possibility of pre-Columbian trade routes or earlier indigenous peoples. Judith Kelly would not discuss this, warned me away from further exploration. July 11th, heard vocalizations during last night's perimeter check. Not animal, not human. Sounded like language, structured, complex, with emotional content. Lasted 17 minutes, started and stopped at precisely 2300 hours. Occurred again at 0300. Pattern indicates intentionality. August 5th. Something is watching the station. Not constantly, but at regular intervals. Early morning, usually between 0400 and 0500. I have found impressions outside the perimeter, multiple locations. The size, it cannot be accurate, but the depth of the print suggests weight in excess of 800 pounds. The stride length suggests a height of approximately 9 feet. September 3rd. I am going to the structures tomorrow at first light. I have documented their location using GPS. Judith Kelly is correct that I do not understand what lives in this forest, but I cannot leave this mystery to superstition and folklore. There are answers in that valley, and I will not be deterred by rumors of a creature that may not even exist. The final entry was dated September 4th, written at 0637 hours. The structures are older than anything I have encountered. Not Native American construction, or rather, perhaps, but from a period predating the Tlingit migration. The symbols are partially similar to formline designs, but cruder, more ancient. There are skulls arranged in patterns, human skulls, dozens of them, arranged in concentric circles. The largest of them in the center is massive, at least 12 inches in length. The bone is incredibly thick. I need to... The entry ended mid-sentence. Natalie Ramirez arrived at the ranger station on a Friday. She was 35, a federal wildlife specialist, and she had been sent to conduct a survey of the moose population. She wore a vest marked with official insignia and carried equipment that required charging cables and batteries. She represented the federal government's belief that the wilderness could be quantified and categorized and filed away in databases. I will be conducting a 3-week field study, she explained, setting up her equipment in the common area. I will need access to the northern sectors, particularly around Salmon Lake. The moose migration patterns show unusual variation, and I need to determine if there is an ecological imbalance. I did not tell her about Raymond Marsh. Charles Sanders had asked me not to. It will compromise the study, he had said. She needs to move freely without psychological interference. But I did warn her about the protocols. I told her about the stone markers, the boundaries, the requirement to be off the trails before sunset. She listened with the expression of someone hearing ghost stories. Those are folklore precautions, she said. They may have served a cultural purpose, but they are based on fear and limited understanding. I am here to provide scientific evidence. If there are moose in the northern sectors, I need to document them. That night, Judith Kelly came to my quarters. I was living in the small apartment attached to the station, in the space where Raymond Marsh had written his final entries. You should stop her, Judith said. I cannot stop her. She is here under federal authority. I can advise her, but she has not asked for my advice. Then you are complicit in what will happen. Judith moved to the window and looked out at the forest. The creature has been patient. It has allowed your government to place stations and conduct surveys and mark territories with your small stones. It has watched you develop protocols and rules, but patience has limits. There is a hunger that is not satisfied by protocol. There is a hunger that requires action. What is it? I asked. What exactly lives in those forests? It is what remains when a people commit themselves to a guardian covenant. It is what emerges when a tribe gives authority to protect its lands absolutely. The Tlingit entered into an agreement with the spirits of this place. Generations ago, we offered veneration and respect. We offered the knowledge that we would not take more than we needed. We offered sacrifice in the old times, small things, offerings. The creatures that live here accepted our covenant. They became guardians. They became balance. And when you stopped making offerings, we did not stop entirely, but we adapted. We made offerings in other ways. Prayers, respect, careful stewardship. The covenant changed as we changed. But your government came and ignored the covenant entirely. It took the land without permission. It marked boundaries with surveying equipment instead of sacred markers. It extracted resources without asking. And the guardians, they grew angry. The hunger grew. The next morning, Natalie Ramirez set out into the forest with her equipment, her GPS unit, her sample containers. I watched her disappear into the tree line and felt something collapse in my chest. By the end of that day, she had been through 4 quadrants and had marked 47 locations. By the end of the second day, she had reached the Salmon Lake Basin. I asked to review her field notes that evening. The area is remarkable, she said, her eyes bright with the fervor of discovery. There are ancient structures, possibly ceremonial in origin, and there are tracks, massive footprints in the soft earth around the lake. Initial measurement suggests a creature approximately 8 to 9 feet in height. I want to set up trail cameras. We can finally get photographic evidence. You should not go back alone, I said. I will not be alone. Douglas James is arriving tomorrow. He is a wildlife photographer. The two of us can document everything. This could be significant. This could demonstrate that an undocumented primate species exists in North America. Douglas James arrived the next day in a truck laden with camera equipment. He was 54, lean, and had the restless energy of someone who had spent decades chasing images through remote wilderness. He shook my hand with fingers stained by developing chemicals. I have been hunting this creature for 6 years, he said. Every credible sighting I investigated, every piece of evidence I analyzed. This is the closest I have come to genuine documentation. Your colleague Natalie has marked the exact location where multiple sightings were reported. We will get the photographs. We will get the proof. That night, I could not sleep. I sat in Raymond Marsh's chair in the office and read his final entries over and over. There is a hunger that is not satisfied by protocol. The trail cameras went into the forest on the 3rd day of Natalie's survey. Douglas placed them at carefully calculated positions around the perimeter of the Salmon Lake Basin. The cameras were set to trigger on motion, capturing both still photographs and video. They were equipped with infrared, night vision capabilities, and their own power supplies. 8 cameras positioned in an expanding circle around the site. That night there was a storm, not unusual for southeast Alaska in September, but this storm was violent. Wind speeds exceeded 80 miles per hour. Trees came down. Power lines in town were severed. The ranger station lost electricity at approximately 2200 hours. When power was restored the next morning, Natalie and Douglas retrieved the camera footage. They did not share the footage with me directly, but I heard them in the common room, their voices moving through registers of shock, confusion, denial, and finally, something that sounded like fear. I went to them. "We need to leave," Douglas said. "We need to leave today." "What did the cameras capture?" I asked. Natalie stood by the window, her face the color of ash. "Nothing," she said. "The cameras captured nothing. No movement, no images, no animals at all. Just hours and hours of empty forest." "8 cameras," Douglas added. "All functioning, all with full batteries and storage. All aimed at the locations we selected, and every single one shows nothing." "That is not possible," I said. "Unless the creature understood that the cameras were there," Natalie said quietly. "Unless it avoided them. Unless it is intelligent enough to recognize human technology, and intelligent enough to circumvent it." But that was not the only thing the cameras captured. There was one single frame, from camera 7, positioned on the western perimeter of the lake. It was taken at 0347 hours. It showed something standing at the very edge of the frame, so far at the periphery that it was barely visible. The creature's outline was massive. Its shoulders were impossibly broad. Its arms hung past what would have been its knees. Its head was tilted at an angle that no human head could tilt. And it was looking directly at the camera. Not at the location where the camera was mounted, but at the lens itself, as if it could see through the darkness and infrared spectrum directly into the camera's eye. "It is testing us," Carol Watson said. Carol had been monitoring communications from the Federal Wildlife Office. She was 50, with iron gray hair and the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She had arrived that same morning with authorization to take custody of the trail camera footage and the field notes. "You will cease all investigation," she said to Natalie and Douglas. "The footage will be classified as inconclusive. The anomalies will be attributed to equipment malfunction, and this research site will be closed." "But this is proof," Natalie said. "There is a species." "There is nothing," Carol said. Her voice had changed. It was quieter, and it carried the weight of knowledge that was not written in any official capacity. "There is a reason that this land has remained mostly unexplored. There is a reason that the indigenous peoples have maintained strict protocols. And there is a reason that your government has, after careful analysis, decided that certain things should remain unknown." She dismissed us with a gesture, and then she turned to me. "The ranger position here is dangerous," she said. "I am authorized to offer you a transfer. Better pay, better location, anywhere you want in the continental United States." I declined. Carol's mouth tightened. "You have read Raymond Marsh's notes?" "Yes." "Then you understand that curiosity is fatal in this position." "I understand that he died trying to understand something. I cannot run from that." Carol packed the trail camera footage into a secure case. Natalie and Douglas left that evening, and within hours the federal office had issued a statement that the initial sighting reports were unconfirmed and that the area had been cleared of any anomalies. But something had changed in the forest. The silence was different now. The watching was different. Benjamin Brooks, the regional police chief, came to the ranger station 4 days later. He was 42, with a careful expression and the manner of someone who had learned not to ask questions about things that had no acceptable answers. "We have a missing person report," he said. "One of the guides from the town tourism company. He was supposed to lead a group of hikers on the Perseverance Trail. He did not show up. His truck is parked at the trailhead and he is not present." The guide's name was James Palmer. He was 29, experienced, and he had no reason to simply vanish. "Where does the Perseverance Trail lead?" I asked. "It loops through the eastern forest, then curves north toward the Salmon Lake Basin. It does not officially reach the basin. The trail ends about a mile south, but experienced hikers have been known to bushwhack to the structures that others have reported finding." I did not tell Benjamin that the Perseverance Trail was less than a mile from the northwestern boundary marker. I did not tell him that James Palmer had almost certainly violated the protocol by straying into forbidden territory. The search began at dawn. Law enforcement officers, volunteers from the town, search and rescue personnel with dogs. The dogs became anxious within the first half hour, refusing to move into the deeper forest, and their handlers were forced to lead them back out. By the end of the search, the only thing they had found was James Palmer's jacket, hung on a branch about 2 miles from the trailhead. The jacket was inside out. It had been removed with such violence that seams had torn, and it was covered in a smell that nobody in the search party could identify. "Not animal," Benjamin said when I asked what the forensic analysis had determined. "Not human. Chemical composition includes proteins that do not appear in any known species database. The recommendation has come down from federal authorities. We are to list James Palmer as missing, presumed lost. We are not to conduct further search and rescue operations in the area." The autumn equinox arrived, and with it something shifted in the forest. The birds that had migrated south seemed to have gone farther than usual. The bears that should have been preparing for hibernation had been spotted far inland, moving away from their traditional routes. And the silence, the careful, deliberate silence, had become profound. Judith Kelly came to the ranger station on the first day of October. With her came Charles Sanders, the superintendent, and two other Tlingit elders whose names I was told but whose faces I could not focus on long enough to remember. "The treaty must be renewed," Judith said. "What treaty?" I asked. "The original covenant between my people and the creatures of this forest. When your government took this land, they broke the treaty unknowingly. Now the creatures are asking for recompense." "How does one recompense an intelligent creature?" I asked. "By sacrificing that which the creature desires," one of the elders said, "or by accepting the sacrifice that the creature makes on behalf of the broken covenant." "You are talking about human sacrifice," I said. "We are talking about balance," Judith replied. "Raymond Marsh entered the nesting site without permission. He violated a sacred space. The creature took what the creature needed. James Palmer violated the boundary markers and entered protected territory. The creature took recompense. Both of these were warnings that your government failed to understand." Charles Sanders was trembling. "What happens if the protocol is not re-established?" he asked. "The creature will continue to take," Judith said. "It will take until the land has been vacated. It will take until the violation has been answered in the amount that matches the violation. Or it will take until those responsible for the violation choose to offer themselves as the payment." I understood in that moment why Raymond Marsh had become obsessed with the Northern Territories. It was not scientific curiosity. It was a recognition of something that was not acknowledged in any official capacity, something that existed beneath the surface of government bureaucracy and indigenous oral tradition, something that demanded explanation and refused to accept the absence of it as an answer. "How many," I asked, "will it take?" "That is not for us to determine," Judith said. "The creature determines when balance has been achieved, but historically, when a covenant is broken this severely, it requires three. Three? Raymond Marsh, James Palmer, and someone else." The next month passed in a state of waiting. I maintained the ranger station. I patrolled the trails within the permitted boundaries. I did not venture beyond the boundary markers, though I took the map that Raymond Marsh had created and I studied the notations with the intensity of someone trying to decode a message from a dead man. Natalie Ramirez called me from a research position in British Columbia. "I have been analyzing the trail camera data," she said, "the data that I was not supposed to retain. There was a pattern to the creature's movements, predictable vectors, territorial routes. I have cross-referenced this data with indigenous stories from tribes across the Pacific Northwest. Raymond, there are dozens of documented stories about a large bipedal creature that inhabits old forests, and in every single story the creature has the same territorial pattern, the same way of moving through space, the same behavioral traits. I do not think this is a single creature. I think it is a species that has maintained its territory across thousands of years while human populations have risen and fallen around it." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I think whatever killed those two men is still there, and I think it is not finished." 4 days later, Charles Sanders came to the ranger station. He came alone, which was unusual, because Charles did not venture into the field. "I am being transferred," he said. "Internal review determined that my management of the ranger position was deficient. I will be relocated to an office in Anchorage far from any field operations." "Because of the missing persons?" I asked. "Because of everything," Charles said. "Because this region is designated as a federal preserve and yet decisions are being made about it that are not being made by the federal government. Because the indigenous peoples have rights that supersede our authority, and we have spent decades pretending that is not true. Because there is something in these forests that your government does not have the power to control or contain." "So you are running," I said. "I am accepting that I made a mistake," Charles replied. "I hired you because you seemed like someone who could manage an impossible situation. Now I understand that I was looking for someone to take responsibility for what nobody should be responsible for." But before Charles left, he gave me something. It was a letter, written in Raymond Marsh's handwriting, dated 3 days before his final entry. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then I have made the final choice. I have accepted that the mystery cannot be solved. It can only be lived with, and I have decided that I do not wish to live with it. I am going to the nesting site tonight. I am going to offer myself, not because I wish to die, but because I wish to know, and there is no other way to achieve knowledge in this place. The creature is not evil. It is maintaining a boundary that my government has violated. It is enforcing a law that predates any law we have written. And if my death is the cost of that enforcement, then at least my death will mean something. At least it will be part of something larger than myself. The letter continued for pages, becoming more incoherent, more fragmented. Raymond Marsh had written about the structures in the basin, about the human skulls arranged in concentric circles, about the feeling of being watched, about the sound of something massive moving through the forest at night. He wrote about Judith Kelly's warning, about the protocols that he had ignored, about the hunger that was not satisfied by protocol. The final paragraph of the letter said, "I am going to walk into the forest tonight. I am going to reach the nesting site, and when I reach it, I am going to lay down my weapons and my tools and my certainty. I am going to speak the old words that the Tlingit elders taught me, and I am going to ask if there is mercy in this place. If there is mercy, I will survive. If there is not, at least I will have asked." On October 31st, I found the boots. They were arranged on the step of the ranger station, placed there with obvious deliberation. The boots were new, or nearly new, and they were sized for someone of my approximate height and weight. Beside them was a note, written in a hand that was not my own, but which was formed from materials found in the forest. The note said, "The protocol requires a renewal. You are invited to offer yourself Oregon to choose a substitute. The creature will not wait beyond the first snow." I knew what the boots meant. I knew what the forest was asking. And I understood for the first time why Raymond Marsh had written his letter, why he had come to the conclusion that knowledge was worth the price of life. But there was another possibility. I drove into town and I went to Judith Kelly's house. She was waiting for me, as if she had always known I would come. "There is a substitute," I said. It was not a question. "Yes," Judith said. "There is always a substitute, if one is willing to provide it. The creature does not require a specific person. It requires a sacrifice that is chosen. It requires an offering that is made willingly, or as willingly as such things can be made." "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "That is for you to decide," Judith said. I left her house and I drove to the ranger station. I sat in Raymond Marsh's office and I held his letter and I understood what he had been trying to tell me. The creature was not the problem. The government was not the problem. The problem was that there were things that existed beyond the reaches of human authority, and they could not be negotiated with or compromised with or made to fit into official reports. They could only be acknowledged, and the acknowledgement had to be paid for in blood. I drove back to town and I went to the federal building where the wildlife office was located. Carol Watson was there, reviewing documents. When she saw me, her expression changed. "You are going to offer yourself," she said. "No," I replied, "but I want you to understand what is happening here. The federal government has claimed authority over land that already had a guardian. You have established protocols to manage resources and conduct surveys and document species, but you have ignored the primary protocol, the one that has existed since before your government existed. And that protocol is this: the land is not yours. The land belongs to those who maintain a covenant with it. And when the covenant is broken, there is a price." Carol stood up. "The creature will not stop," I said. "If you continue to operate in the northern sectors as if the protocols do not exist, it will continue to take. People will vanish. Disappearances will be attributed to accidents or voluntary abandonment, but you will know the truth. You will know that every disappearance is a statement. The creature is telling you that it is not bound by your laws." "What do you want?" Carol asked. "I want you to acknowledge the protocol," I said. "I want you to work with the Tlingit elders to establish boundaries that match the traditional territories. I want you to cease all research operations in the prohibited areas. I want you to tell the truth about what happened to Raymond Marsh and James Palmer." Carol did not speak for a long moment. "Those things are not possible," she said finally. "The federal government cannot acknowledge the existence of an unclassified species. It cannot yield territorial control to indigenous peoples, no matter how legitimate their claim. It cannot admit that there are places in the United States where the federal government is not the highest authority. Then the creature will continue to take," I said. I left the federal building and I drove back to the ranger station. The boots were still on the step, waiting. On November 2nd, Benjamin Brooks called me. There had been a report of a missing person in town. A woman named Brittany Price, 32 years old, who worked in the federal wildlife office. She had been on a hiking expedition along the Perseverance Trail. She had not returned. I already knew she would not be returning. Judith Kelly came to the ranger station that night. "The protocol has been satisfied," she said, "for now. The creature has taken what was required. Balance has been achieved, though it is not the balance that should have been achieved. A woman who had nothing to do with the violation paid with her life so that your government could continue its ignorance. This is how it happens. This is how the innocent become substitutes for the powerful. I did not ask how Brittany Price had ended up on the Perseverance Trail. I did not ask what sound had echoed through the forest when the creature found her. I did not ask what she had left behind. Instead, I took the boots and I placed them in a box. I took Raymond Marsh's letter and I placed it in the box. I took everything that connected me to what the forest was demanding and I placed it in the box. And then I made a choice. I resigned from my position as ranger of the Juneau district. I packed my things and I left Southeast Alaska and I came to another part of the world where the forests do not demand payment in blood. But I took with me the knowledge that there are places on this earth where human authority means nothing. There are boundaries that cannot be crossed. There are covenants that cannot be broken without consequence. And there are creatures that will wait, patient and hungry, until the balance has been restored. The boots remain in a storage facility. The letter remains in a box beneath my bed. And Raymond Marsh's map remains in my office, marked with a single question in handwriting that is not my own. Will you be next to visit the nesting site, or will you run? The answer is this: I chose to run. And I have spent every day since wondering if running was the right choice, or if it was simply a longer, slower version of what the creature had already begun to take. The forest is still there. The creature is still there. And the protocols are still being ignored by people who do not know what they are ignoring. Somewhere in Juneau, in a ranger station surrounded by a spiral of stones, someone new is sitting at Raymond Marsh's desk, and they are probably reading his notes and thinking the same thing he thought, that they can solve the mystery, that they can understand what is happening, that the protocols are just superstition and folklore and stories that frightened people tell themselves in the dark. They are wrong. But that is how it always works. The forest teaches very slowly, and it teaches its lessons in blood. The boots are still waiting. They are waiting for the next person who will be foolish enough to ask the wrong questions in a place where the questions should never be asked at all. I can still hear the rain against the cabin windows. It has been 3 months and I still turn around when I think I hear footsteps in the hallway. My supervisor asked me to write this down, to explain what happened in Skagway last season. So here it is. Everything I saw. Everything I still cannot explain. And please, if you work in these mountains, if you ever hear the old songs echoing through the valleys at night, you need to understand what they mean. You need to understand why the First Nations peoples never went into the deep interior alone. My name is Justin Morris, and I have been a park ranger for 12 years. I specialize in the Northern Territories, Alaska primarily, where the mountains rise like broken teeth and the forests swallow sound itself. Skagway sits at the edge of the Inside Passage where rainforest meets glacier and the ground remembers things that people have forgotten. The Park Service assigned me there last April, replacing an older ranger named Dennis Reed who had worked those boundaries for 18 years. Dennis did not retire by choice. He had to leave. He could not talk about why. The briefing was sparse, 2 pages, double-spaced, telling me nothing of value. The region bordered Tlingit ancestral lands. Hunting regulations were strict. Stay on marked trails. Report wildlife incidents to headquarters before engaging. Standard protocol. But when I arrived at the ranger station, a small structure built in 1987, Dennis was still there. He had stayed an extra week to transition me. His hands shook when he showed me the supply closet. We sat in the station office, and he looked at the calendar on the wall like it might explode. Dennis was a large man, weathered, the kind of person who seemed constructed from the landscape itself. His eyes were not right. They had the quality of someone who had seen something his brain could not process, and the seeing had left him incomplete. I asked him what made the job difficult. He took a long time to answer. When he finally spoke, he said only this: "The boundary is not a line on a map. The boundary is something that breathes." Then he left. I thought it was madness. I thought it was the cold and the isolation, the way the mountains make people strange. I had worked in difficult territories. I had tracked wolverines through blizzards. I had recovered bodies. I knew what the wilderness did to people. This was just another case of a man who had stayed too long in the silence. By August, I understood that Dennis had not been mad at all. He had been a witness, and he had been trying to warn me. The first unusual report came on the 19th of August. A group of tourists had called the station reporting a disturbance near Chilco Pass. They were hiking one of the designated trails, a popular route that takes about 8 hours round trip, when they encountered something that had frightened them profoundly. They refused to describe it in detail. One of them, a woman named Victoria Cook, kept saying that the smell was wrong, that it was like nothing an animal should smell like, and that they had heard vocalizations that seemed to come from multiple locations simultaneously, though they saw nothing. I filed a standard wildlife report. Possibly bear activity, possibly a moose protecting territory. The vagueness made me suspicious, but tourists panic easily. I did not consider it significant. In retrospect, I should have recognized the pattern. Victoria Cook had not seen the creature. She had heard it. She had smelled it. She had felt its presence the way prey animals feel the presence of a predator they cannot yet locate. The senses had registered something the eyes had missed, and her rational mind had rejected the conclusion entirely. 3 days later, another report, this time from Dennis. He had driven down from his new post 200 miles south. He found me repairing the shed door. He was thinner than I remembered, moved like a man underwater. He asked me if I had a map of the interior territories, not the tourist routes, the real interior. I showed him the topographic maps we used for search and rescue operations. Large-scale, detailed, showing elevations and water features and the places where the forest became so dense that even light seemed to be uncertain there. Dennis studied the maps for a long time. Then he pointed to a ridge system that ran northeast from Chilkoot Pass, a place that was not on any trail, that served no purpose for recreation. He said, "Stay away from the old Tlingit valleys. That is where the reports came from when I was here. Not visible places, not the trails. The places that are still alive." I asked him what was still alive in the valleys. He could not answer. He put his hand over his mouth like the words might escape without his permission, and they might change something if they did. After a moment he left. He drove away in the rain, and I have not seen him since. But he had given me a direction. Not towards danger, but towards understanding. I pulled all the station records from his tenure, 15 years of incident reports and wildlife surveys and ranger notes. Most of it was standard, but there were patterns I had not noticed initially. Certain areas of the interior were flagged as requiring additional patrols. Certain trails had higher than normal abandonment rates, meaning tourists who started them did not finish. And certain entries were cryptic, written in language that seemed deliberately obscure. One note, dated 6 years prior, read, "The observation platforms at the ridge should not be visited after 1800 hours. Something responds to human presence in the valleys below during the period of reduced light. Multiple witnesses report the sensation of being observed from impossible distances. Heightened neural activity reported post-encounter." Another note, from 4 years ago. Nathan Morgan reported hearing what he described as singing or vocalization patterns that seemed to contain structure and purpose. He said it reminded him of the old Tlingit stories his grandmother had told him. He requested reassignment. Nathan Morgan was on my list of people to interview. He was still living in Skagway, working as a fishing guide. I contacted him the next day. He agreed to meet me at the marina at noon. Nathan Morgan was a compact man, muscular with the careful movements of someone who has learned to respect both the ocean and the things living beneath it. He was 53 years old but appeared younger except for his eyes, which had the same uncertain quality I had observed in Dennis. When I mentioned that Dennis had sent me to the map, Nathan went very still. He ordered coffee. I waited while he drank half of it in silence. Then he asked me a question. "Do you know the stories that the old people tell about the territories here?" I told him I did not. Not the real stories, only the sanitized versions. He nodded like this was the answer he expected. Then he began to explain. The Tlingit people, Nathan said, had lived in these territories for thousands of years. They had developed an intricate relationship with the landscape and the creatures within it. That relationship was based on respect and on understanding that certain places were more than physical locations. Certain places were alive in ways that were difficult to describe to people who had only ever learned about the world through empirical science. The valleys that Dennis had pointed to, the old Tlingit valleys, had specific significance. They were believed to be a crossing place, a threshold between territories. The old stories spoke of entities that moved through those valleys, entities that were neither animal nor spirit in the way Western understanding would categorize them. They were beings that understood human language and human intent. They were beings that responded to disrespect. When the logging companies came, Nathan said, they logged near the boundaries of those valleys. When the tourists came, some of them hiked into the valleys. And when those things happened, the being or beings that inhabited those territories responded. The response was not always violent. Sometimes it was observation. Sometimes it was communication. Sometimes it was a presence so profound that the human nervous system interpreted it as a threat, regardless of whether actual danger was present. I asked him if he was describing Bigfoot. He looked disappointed in the question. He said that Bigfoot was a reductive category, a name invented by people who did not understand what they were seeing. What he was describing was something that had many names in many languages. The Tlingit called it by a word that translated roughly to the one who walks the old roads. The Haida had a different name. The Kwakwaka names were different still. The one thing they had in common was that all the peoples who lived here acknowledged that it existed, not as a myth, not as folklore, as something present and active and responding to the presence of humans in its territories. I asked Nathan what had happened to him in the valleys. He was quiet for a long time. Through the coffee shop window, I could see the dock and the water and the mountains in the distance, rising up like the walls of some vast container designed to hold exactly what was being held. He said, I went into the interior to collect ginseng roots. My grandmother needed them for medicine. It was late summer, beginning of the season when the plants are most potent. I went alone because I had been going alone my entire life. The valleys are not far from the main trails. You can reach them in about 2 hours of hiking through the forest. I found the plants where they always grew, in a specific clearing where the earth was rich and the light came through the canopy in a particular way. I was collecting, focused on the work, when I realized that everything had become very quiet. Not the normal quiet of a forest, the intentional quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when everything living stops moving because a predator is present. I stood up. I was not afraid yet. I had learned in childhood not to be afraid of the valleys. My grandmother had taught me the old protocols, the ways you were supposed to move, the ways you were supposed to acknowledge presence. When the valley fell silent, you did not run. You did not make yourself small. You made yourself present and respectful, and you waited. Behind me, I heard something breathe. It was not the breath of anything I had heard before. It was a breathing that seemed to come from a large body, from something that had to exchange a lot of air to function. It was the breathing of something that was a certain size, the size that creates presence. I turned around carefully. I moved slowly. I kept my hands visible. Everything I had been taught told me that the being wanted to be acknowledged, not feared. There was nothing there. I mean, physically, there was nothing visible. No shape, no silhouette against the trees. But the air had changed. The light seemed to be falling differently. And I could smell something now. Something that was organic but not animal. Something that was heavy and ancient and carried in it the scent of things that grew in places where the sun did not reach. I heard the vocalization then. It was not a sound that started anywhere specific. It was like the sound came from the forest itself, from the trees and the rocks and the accumulated moss and the rotting wood. It came from everywhere and nowhere. It was a low sound, a vibration more than a voice. But underneath the vibration there was structure, there was pattern. There was something that resembled language the way a fossil resembles the animal it once was. Recognizable, meaningful, but dead. Or not dead. Waiting. Nathan stopped talking. His hands had developed a slight tremor. He set the coffee cup down very carefully, like he was afraid of what would happen if it made too much noise. I asked him if the sound had contained words. He said, "It contained my words. That is what was terrible. It spoke in English. It spoke using my own language, my own vocabulary, but it was arranging them in patterns I had never heard before. It was like listening to a child speak your language after learning it from written records only. All the technical elements are correct, but the emotion, the intention is wrong. It is uncanny. It creates a feeling in the nervous system that is very difficult to describe." I asked what it said. Nathan looked at me for a long time. Then he answered. "It said my name. It said Nathan Morgan. It said it exactly the way my grandmother does. And then it said, 'You have come to gather medicines.' That is respectful, but the manner of your gathering is imbalanced. You take 3 plants, but you offer nothing. The balance is broken. The valley remembers when balance existed." Nathan stood up to leave. I grabbed his wrist. I asked him, "What did you do? What did you offer?" Nathan extracted his arm from my grip carefully. He said, "I understood, in that moment, that the being was not interested in harming me. It was interested in communication. It was interested in reminding me that I was in a place where different rules applied, where the relationship between human and landscape was contractual, not exploitative." I placed the ginseng plants I had gathered in a pile on the ground. I removed the knife I was carrying. I removed my jacket. I laid them down as offerings. I told the being that I understood, that I would rebalance, that I would leave the valleys with nothing but the memory of what lived here. And then the presence withdrew. Not quickly, not aggressively. It simply unconcentrated itself, like a fist unclenching. The forest sounds returned. The birds began to sing again. The normal quality of silence returned to the space. Nathan left the coffee shop without finishing his coffee. At the door, he said one final thing. Tell Dennis that the valleys are getting hungrier. The creatures there sense that humans are no longer balanced. They sense disrespect spreading like an infection, and they are beginning to respond in ways that are less like communication and more like warning. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in my small ranger apartment and listened to the rain and thought about patterns. Dennis warning me. Nathan describing impossible communication. The reports in the files suggesting that something in the interior territories was aware of human presence in increasingly specific ways. By morning, I had decided to assemble an expedition into the old Tlingit valleys. The decision was against protocol. The decision was against the carefully documented concerns of my predecessor. But I was young enough still to believe that I could understand things if I studied them carefully enough. I was professional enough to think that proper documentation could make sense of the inexplicable. I recruited 4 people. The first was Victoria Cook, the tourist who had initially reported the vocalizations at Chilkoot Pass. She was an academic of some kind, I learned when I tracked her down through the Park Service database. She had a master's degree in ethnomusicology and had come to Skagway specifically to study the acoustic properties of the Tlingit territories. The disturbance she had experienced had only deepened her research questions. She agreed to join the expedition immediately. The second was Aaron Murphy, a wilderness survival specialist and tracker who had worked with the Park Service in various capacities over the years. He was 51 years old and had credentials that suggested he had spent more time in remote territories than most people spend in civilization. I knew his reputation. He was careful. He was methodical. He did not make assumptions about what the landscape contained. The third was Janice Bell, who had once been a ranger herself and now worked as a historical interpreter at the Chilkoot Trail Visitor Center. She was 63, and she had spent 40 years in these mountains. She knew the old stories. She knew the proper protocols. I needed her knowledge of what the Tlingit peoples had always understood about these territories. The fourth was someone I did not recruit myself. She appeared at the ranger station 3 days before our planned departure. Her name was Teresa Rogers. She was 45 years old and worked for an agency that I later learned was vaguely affiliated with the government, but in ways that were not entirely transparent. She arrived with credentials that suggested she had authorization to be involved in sensitive investigations in federal lands. She said she had heard about my expedition through channels that she would not specify. She said that she wanted to document what I found. She said that there had been other incidents like the ones reported in Skagway, incidents that had been classified or contained or explained away in ways that did not satisfy official curiosity. I should have been suspicious. I was, to some degree. But Teresa had a quality of competence and certainty that made refusal feel impossible. She said the words, "We need to understand what this is," and I believed her. We departed at dawn on August 28th. The weather was manageable. The clouds were high. The mountains were visible. We moved through the familiar terrain of the trail system and then, at a marked boundary, we left the established paths and entered the interior forest. The transition was immediate and disorienting. The trail system was maintained. It was cleared. It was predictable. The interior forest was none of these things. The trees were old growth, massive, the kind of Douglas firs and western hemlocks that have been growing since before the park existed. The understory was thick. Moss covered every horizontal surface, and the light fell through the canopy in such a way that it was difficult to maintain orientation. The compass worked, the map was accurate, but emotionally and perceptually we entered a different space entirely. We moved slowly. Aaron took point, moving through the forest with a kind of fluid attention that I came to respect deeply. He was reading the environment constantly, noting patterns in the moss growth and the animal trails and the way the branches were bent. Victoria recorded the sounds. The ambient forest noise was complex, layered, the result of thousands of organisms existing in the same space. She noted the absence of certain birds, the presence of what sounded like large animal vocalizations at distances she found difficult to calculate. Janice moved beside me. She was quiet, focused, but I could sense something in her that was not relaxation. It was expectation. She was moving through a familiar place, returning to a place that her cultural memory recognized. On the afternoon of the second day, we arrived at the old Tlingit valleys. The geography opened suddenly. The dense forest gave way to a series of meadows and clearings, bordered by steep cliffs and old-growth trees that seemed to lean inward. The valleys created their own weather system. The clouds that formed above the higher elevations descended into the valleys like water poured into a container. The light was strange, thin. the kind of light that suggests the normal rules of physics might be negotiable. We established a camp in the central clearing, away from the cliff edges, near a stream that moved with purpose toward some unknown downstream destination. The camp was professional, secure. We established a watch rotation. We set boundaries that everyone understood. We were careful. That first night, nothing happened. That second night, I heard the singing. It came from the valleys, from multiple directions simultaneously, from the cliffs and from the forest edges and from the stream itself. It was not a human voice. It was not an animal vocalization. It was something intermediate, something that had learned language the way Victoria's description had suggested. Not organically, not naturally, but through some other form of comprehension. The singing contained words, not English words, though I was somehow understanding them. It was the Tlingit language, or a simulation of it, or the Tlingit language as spoken by something that understood the words intellectually but had never felt the emotional resonance they were meant to carry. I woke everyone except Aaron, who was already standing outside the tent, listening with an intensity that suggested he was trying to memorize every aspect of the sound. The singing lasted approximately 37 minutes. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was absolute, complete, the silence of something having finished its expression and withdrawn. Nobody slept after that. In the morning we held a meeting in the center of the camp. Victoria had recorded the vocalizations. She was playing segments back through a portable speaker, analyzing frequencies, looking for harmonic patterns that might suggest an animal origin. The patterns, she said, were almost musical, almost structured like language, but structured in a way that suggested a different linguistic architecture than human language possessed, like instructions written in a medium that had never been intended for human comprehension. Janice asked if we could play the recording to the landscape itself. Everyone looked at her like she had suggested something absurd. She explained, "The old protocols are about communication, about acknowledging presence and intention and balance." Nathan Morgan had understood this. He had offered objects as a demonstration of respect. What we are doing here is observation without participation. We are scientific. We are removed. That is the disrespect. Aaron asked her what she proposed. Janice described a ceremony that her grandmother had taught her. It was not a complex ceremony. It involved arranging stones in particular patterns. It involved leaving food and objects that represented human craftsmanship. It involved speaking acknowledgement. It involved treating the valleys as a living space that deserved reciprocity, not as a museum or a laboratory. Teresa objected. She said that we were there to document and understand, not to engage in activities that might be interpreted as offering to an unknown entity. We did not know what the entity wanted. We did not know if acknowledgement might be interpreted as submission or capitulation. Janice responded calmly. We know exactly what it wants. It wants balance. It wants respect. It wants the landscape to be treated as a conscious thing, not as a resource. The disrespect is what created the initial vocalizations, the attempt to understand something without acknowledging its right to be understood on its own terms. Victoria supported Janice. Aaron supported Janice. Teresa was outvoted. We spent the afternoon gathering stones from the valley floor. We arranged them in patterns that Janice described as representing the relationship between human and landscape. We placed food that we had brought, items of cultural significance, in the center of the arrangement. Aaron contributed his knife. Victoria contributed a recording device. I contributed the map I had been carrying. Janice contributed nothing and said that her acknowledgement was the contribution itself. That evening, we placed the gathering near the stream, in a location that would be visible from multiple points in the valley system. That night, the presence returned. It did not arrive in vocalizations. It arrived in something more profound. It arrived as a sensation of attention, of consciousness, focused on the camp with such intensity that the air seemed to change density. The fire we had maintained burned differently. The shadows moved differently. The light from the stars seemed to be moving through a medium that was not quite air. I stood outside the tent and tried not to move. The sensation was not painful. It was not aggressive. But it contained a quality of profound otherness, of consciousness that operated on different principles than human consciousness. It was the kind of presence that should have generated fear but instead generated something closer to awe. Then, slowly, something moved into the edge of the firelight. I could not fully perceive what I was seeing. My eyes and my brain were not in agreement about what was being presented to my visual cortex. The shape suggested something large, something that moved bipedally, something that was covered in what might have been hair or might have been something else entirely. But the perception flickered. The image seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Sometimes it was darker, more animal. Sometimes it seemed almost anthropomorphic. Sometimes the proportions seemed wrong in ways that made my visual system feel like it was processing corrupted data. It moved around the circle of stones. It examined the offerings. It spent a long time looking at the map. Aaron, standing beside me, whispered, "Do not move. Do not acknowledge. Let it acknowledge you." The creature picked up the map. It held it in appendages that might have been hands or might have been something else. It seemed to study the drawn boundaries, the marked territories, the attempt to reduce landscape to human understanding. Then it tore the map in half. Not aggressively, almost gently. It turned toward the camp. It turned toward me. The eyes, when they focused on me, were too many and too few. The expression, if an expression was present, contained something that resembled sadness mixed with a kind of patient judgment. The sense of attention became more concentrated, more focused. I felt like I was being read, like the entirety of my existence was being examined and evaluated against some kind of standard I did not have access to. Then, from inside the tent, Victoria made a sound. It was not loud. It was not intended as communication. It was a cry of distress or fear or overwhelm. It was a human sound in a place where human sounds should not exist. The creature turned. The attention shifted. For a moment, the sense of otherness increased to a point where I felt like I might lose consciousness. Then the creature moved backward, into the darkness, away from the camp. The presence withdrew entirely. The normal quality of night returned. The air became lighter. The sensation of profound attention evaporated. But something had changed. The creature had shown us what it was. Not entirely, not completely, but enough that we could no longer pretend to not understand that something impossible existed in those valleys. We broke camp at dawn. The evacuation was efficient but not rushed. Aaron had learned something during the night encounter, something that made him believe that sudden movement might trigger response. We gathered our equipment. We left the offerings in place. We moved back toward the interior forest, with Janice leading and Victoria documenting everything with her recording devices. 2 hours into the return journey, we found Dennis Reed. He was in the middle of the trail, waiting for us, looking like he had been standing there for some time. His eyes were different now, less haunted. He looked at me with an expression that suggested he had completed some kind of calculation he had been working on. He said, "I came back. I could not let you do this alone. I came back to help you understand what is actually happening here." We established a secondary camp, a small camp, away from the main trail but not approaching the valleys again. Dennis explained that he had never actually left the area. He had transferred to a different station, but he had maintained residence in Skagway. He had been researching. He had been talking to the old people. He had been building a framework to understand what was occurring. The creature, or creatures, Dennis said, were not fully physical beings. That was important to understand. They existed in a state that was partially physical and partially something else. The Tlingit words that Janice provided translated to something like beings of threshold, or entities that exist between states. For thousands of years, the Tlingit peoples had coexisted with these beings because they understood the protocols. They understood that the landscape was alive, that the creatures in it operated according to rules that were not the rules of normal animal behavior. The relationship was old. It was contractual. It was based on mutual recognition and respect. When logging came, when tourists came, when the landscape began to be treated as a resource instead of as a conscious system, the beings responded. At first, the response was subtle, attraction to areas where disrespect was highest, vocalizations that tried to communicate in human languages, attempts to establish communication protocols that humans could understand, but humans had not understood. Humans had categorized the creatures as an unknown animal, had tried to hunt them, had tried to prove their existence through the frameworks of empirical science. The beings had responded to this disrespect by beginning to appear directly, to manifest in ways that could not be ignored or explained away. Dennis had documentation. He had files of incidents from other locations where similar beings had interacted with humans. The government knew, some elements of the government knew, but the knowledge was classified because it contradicted too many assumptions about the nature of reality, about the world being a dead thing that could be studied and understood and managed through rational frameworks. What was happening in Skagway was part of a larger pattern. The beings were becoming more active. The boundary between human territories and their territories was becoming increasingly porous. Things were shifting. I asked Dennis why he was telling me this now. He said, "Because you have made contact. Because you and your group have crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. And because the being you encountered was trying to tell you something. It was showing you what disrespect looks like from the perspective of something that has been disrespected for generations. I asked what it wanted. Dennis said, "I do not know, none of us know. But I think it is preparing for something. I think the balance is breaking down further, and the beings are gathering in preparation for a response that might be far more severe than vocalizations in the night." At that moment, Nathan Morgan emerged from the forest. He looked panicked. He had come to find me. Something had happened in the town. Multiple people had reported unusual incidents, a sense of being watched, a sensation of profound attention focused on specific locations, and one person had gone missing. Christine Bailey, who worked as a nurse at the community clinic, had vanished from her home. She had last been seen the night before, and no trace of her had been found. The local constabulary was beginning a search, but something about the disappearance suggested that conventional search methods might not be adequate. We abandoned the camp. We moved back toward the town as quickly as the forest would allow. The search for Christine Bailey lasted 4 days. She was not found. The search expanded to include neighboring areas, tracking dogs, aerial surveillance. Christine Bailey had simply ceased to exist in any location that human effort could access. On the 5th day, I received a visitor. It was a woman named Victoria Cook. But it was not the Victoria Cook who had left me in the forest 2 days prior. This Victoria was exactly the same in every physical detail, but the quality of her presence was different. The way she moved suggested different physical principles. The way her eyes focused suggested different perceptual mechanisms. She sat across from me in the ranger station office. I did not run. I did not sound an alarm. I understood at some level that bypassed rational analysis, that what was sitting across from me had been Victoria before in some sense, and might still be Victoria in another sense entirely. She said Christine wanted to understand. She wanted to come to the valleys. She wanted to make the journey that your group made. I tried to explain that the process was dangerous, that the boundaries between states were difficult to navigate. But she was persistent, and her disrespect was profound. I asked what had happened to her. Victoria said, "She is undergoing integration. The valleys exist partially in physical space and partially in other spaces. When someone enters the valleys with enough intensity of desire to understand, they can cross between states. Christine crossed. She is becoming something intermediate, something that understands both languages, both ways of being." I asked if she was suffering. Victoria, or the being wearing Victoria's form, paused for a long moment. Then she said, "She is experiencing something that humans do not have language for. It is not suffering. It is not pleasure. It is a kind of profound transformation, like a chrysalis breaking apart to make room for what comes next." I asked why she was telling me this. Victoria said, "Because the boundary is collapsing. Because humans and the beings of threshold are beginning to blur into each other. Because Christine is not the only one this will happen to. There are others in the valleys now, others who have ventured into the interior seeking understanding, seeking communication, seeking transformation. And there will be more." And then she left. She stood up and walked to the door and stepped out into the afternoon light. When I followed her, there was nobody there. She had simply ceased to exist in physical space, or had moved into a state that physical sight could not perceive. I filed a report with the Park Service. I explained the disappearance as a hiking accident, a person who had ventured into the interior and had been unable to navigate the difficult terrain. The report was accepted. The case was closed. Christine Bailey became a cautionary tale about the dangers of the wilderness and the importance of staying on marked trails. But Dennis knew. Janice knew. Aaron knew. Nathan knew. We had entered a knowledge that the normal world, the documented world, the scientific world, could not accommodate. We had seen something that should not exist. We had touched a boundary that should have been impossible. The encounters have continued, not constantly, not aggressively, but subtly, in ways that suggest the boundaries are continuing to collapse. People in Skagway report dreams they cannot quite remember but that leave them fundamentally changed. Tourists have vanished in the interior territories, and when search parties have found their equipment, sometimes they have found notes written in handwriting that contains elements of handwriting from the missing person but that is distinctly other. The notes speak of understanding. They speak of integration. They speak of gratitude for the opportunity to know something larger than human consciousness can normally contain. The Park Service wants to expand tourism. They want to improve infrastructure. They want to open the interior territories more fully. They are not aware of what is happening, or perhaps on some level they are aware and do not care. Perhaps the disrespect is too profitable. Perhaps the crossing is inevitable. I remain in Skagway. I maintain my position as a ranger. I have learned the protocols that Janice teaches me. I leave offerings. I acknowledge the presence. I try to move through the territories with the kind of respect that might slow the convergence, that might grant humans and the beings of threshold time to reach some form of mutual understanding before the boundary breaks down completely. But I can feel something shifting. The mountains are watching more carefully. The valleys are breathing differently. The songs that come at night are becoming more structured, more communicative, more urgent. Something is preparing. Something is gathering. Something is waiting for a moment when the disrespect reaches a critical threshold, and the boundary between their world and ours can no longer be maintained. That moment is coming. I do not know how long we have, but I know it is coming. And if you work in these mountains, if you ever hear those songs in the darkness, if you ever feel that particular quality of attention focused on your presence, understand what you are experiencing. You are being evaluated. You are being asked to choose whether you will respect the landscape as a living thing or whether you will perpetuate the disrespect that is drawing something ancient and patient and increasingly less willing to compromise toward our territories. Choose carefully. The valleys are no longer breathing alone. The moose carcass was positioned wrong. That was my first thought when I found it draped across the logging road 3 miles from the ranger station. Not scattered. Not half buried in a predator's cache. Positioned. Arranged on its side like something had carefully displayed it. One foreleg bent backward at an angle no predator would ever fold it. The head faced east toward the mountains. The ribs had been opened from the inside, and everything inside was gone, but the ribs themselves remained intact. Surgical. Intentional. I am a park ranger at Denali. My name is Ronald Green. I have worked this park for 41 years, and I have never seen an arrangement like this. That was 15 days ago, before I understood what the arrangement meant. Before the research team from the university sent 4 people into the mountains to collect hair samples from the high valleys. Before Amy Baker stopped answering her satellite phone. Before the other rangers found what was left of her camp at mile marker 17, and before they found something else entirely in the gloom beneath the spruce trees. But I need to tell you something first, because what happened to us, what is still happening to us, has nothing to do with coincidence and everything to do with a covenant that was broken centuries ago. The Athabascan people who lived in these mountains for 10,000 years called it Tunguska. Not the creature itself, but the presence, the weight of something old and conscious that shared the land with them. They did not hunt it, they did not fear it in the way modern people fear predators. They respected a boundary. There are old journals in the territorial archives. I found them after Amy disappeared. Written by fur traders and missionaries in the 1920s and 1930s, accounts from Athabascan elders who spoke about the packs that existed before contact, the way their people used totem markers, carved poles and stone arrangements to mark the places where Tunguska belonged, the territories where it should not be disturbed. One journal entry written in 1934 by a Jesuit named Father Edmund Chisholm described a conversation with an elder named Natak, whose family had lived in the Denali Basin for 15 generations. Natak explained that Tunguska was not a god and not a beast in the Christian sense. It was something else. Something that had evolved in these mountains alongside human beings but evolved along a different path. It was intelligent in ways that did not require speech or civilization. It was territorial in ways that had nothing to do with hunger, and it had made an agreement. The agreement was this. The Athabascan people would respect the markers. The high valleys beyond the totem stones belonged to Tunguska. The river valleys and the lower mountain slopes belonged to the people. In the winters, when Tunguska came down from the high country to hunt, humans would not interfere. They would move their camps, they would light no fires, they would not even defend themselves if encounter happened. And in return, Tunguska would not cross the marked boundary. It would not enter the camps of humans. It would not hunt in the lower territories. 10,000 years. Father Chisholm wrote that Natak claimed the boundary had held for 10,000 years, but the boundary markers were gone now. The modern park system did not recognize them. The logging roads did not respect them. The research camps were placed wherever the grant money decided to place them. And the agreement, whatever it was, had begun to unravel. The first sign was the moose arrangement. The second sign was Amy Baker's silence. The third sign was the message we found carved into the back of her research tent, deep gouges in the canvas that only made sense when you understood what you were looking at. It was a totem, a boundary marker, carved in the language of claw and warning, telling us without words what the old journals had promised centuries ago. We had entered the territory, and the covenant had begun its accounting. Amy Baker was 44 years old and brilliant in the way that made her dangerous to herself. She held a position at the university studying Pleistocene megafauna adaptability in high-altitude environments. The official record said she was collecting hair and scat samples to establish a genetic baseline for gray wolves in the park's northern reaches. That was a lie she and the university had agreed to tell. What Amy was actually doing was collecting evidence for a different theory, one that required funding sources comfortable with fringe science. She was convinced that something in the Denali Mountains had survived the Ice Age because it had adapted in ways traditional biology could not explain. She had published papers under her own name questioning the extinction narrative of various Pleistocene animals. Now she wanted proof. She brought 3 assistants. Jason Adams was her graduate student, 26 years old, outdoorsy in that performative way that Instagram famous people perform outdoorsiness. Julie Nelson was the field technician, which meant she was the one who actually knew how to collect samples without contaminating them. She was older than she looked, 44 like Amy, and she had worked on every major biological survey in Alaska for the past 2 decades. The third assistant was Ryan Carter, 33, a veterinary specialist Amy had hired specifically because he had experience with unusual species behavior. Ryan was the one who told me something was wrong before Amy disappeared. I met him at the ranger station on day 6 of their expedition. He had come in on one of the service roads looking pale and asking for maps of the high valleys. I gave him the USGS topographic series and asked him what they were tracking. He did not answer directly. Instead, he asked me a question. "In your 41 years here," he said, "have you ever found wolf scat containing human remains?" I told him I had not. "What about prey species with unusual wound patterns?" he continued. "Kills that don't match any predator you know. Arrangements of remains that don't fit natural scavenging behavior." I thought of the moose. I thought of the way its ribs had been opened. "A few," I admitted. "What are you looking for?" Ryan sat down hard on the bench outside the station. Through the window behind him I could see the mountains turning gold in the late afternoon light. The spruce trees looked like they were wading into gloom up there, the light dying faster than it should. "Amy has a hypothesis," Ryan said. "It is insane. Jason thinks it is insane. Julie will not say what she thinks, but Amy is convinced that there is something in those high valleys that is not documented. Something that should not exist according to everything we know about biology and biogeography. She thinks it explains the kill patterns we have been finding in the wildlife management data. Predation events that never match standard wolf or bear behavior. Prey animals positioned in ways that suggest intentionality." "What kind of something?" I asked. Ryan looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "The kind of something that the Athabascan oral histories describe. The kind of something that the old boundary markers were meant to contain." That was when I told him about the journals, about Father Chisholm's account of the covenant, about the totem stones that were no longer there. Ryan listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he asked, "Do you believe it?" I told him I believed that the indigenous people of this region had understood something about this place that modern science was still struggling to articulate. I believed that they would not have maintained a boundary system for 10,000 years unless the boundary was protecting them from something real. And I believed that the moment we stopped respecting the boundary, things would begin to change. "That," Ryan said, "is exactly what Amy believes, and that is why she is moving the base camp deeper into the high valleys, directly toward what the old maps mark as the ancient totem territory. She wants proof that the boundary markers were responding to something. She wants to find physical evidence of why the restriction existed." I asked him if I could come with them. Ryan's expression shifted. There was something in his eyes that looked like the moment before someone makes a confession. "There is already something coming," he said. "I can feel it. Julie mentioned that the wildlife is retreating. Normally this time of year we see elk grazing in the higher meadows. We see them regularly. But since we moved toward the old boundary markers, we have seen nothing. The valleys have gone quiet. That kind of predator-induced silence does not happen naturally. Something is causing it. Something large enough and significant enough that every other living thing is reacting to its presence." "When are you moving the camp deeper?" I asked. "Tomorrow at dawn," Ryan said. "Amy wants to be in the heart of the highest valley by day 3. She wants to establish a base camp at the exact location where Father Chisholm's journals mark the oldest totem stones." I told him I would be ready to accompany them at dawn, but dawn never came to that expedition in the way any of us expected. Because that night Julie Nelson walked into the ranger station with blood on her hands, and she refused to speak about anything except getting the rest of the team out of the mountains immediately. Julie was shaking when she arrived. Not from cold. The temperature outside was dropping below freezing, but her trembling came from something deeper, something that seemed to originate in her bones. She wore hiking clothes streaked with fluid that was not quite blood but not quite anything else. The stains were dark and viscous, and they smelled like copper and something older. Something that reminded me of the smell of glacial melt mixed with decomposing vegetation. I gave her coffee and a blanket and asked her to tell me what happened. She took the coffee but did not drink it. She held the cup between her hands as if needing its warmth for a purpose other than temperature regulation. "We crossed something," she said. "A boundary, not a physical boundary, a sensory boundary, like moving from one medium to another, like walking from air into water and feeling the change in pressure but not understanding why." I told her I did not understand. Julie set down the cup. Her hands were steady now, which was worse somehow, because it meant the trembling was something she could control but was choosing not to. "We reached the valley at dusk," she continued. "The valley marked on your old maps as the sacred territory." Amy was excited. She had found stone arrangements, not current arrangements but ancient ones, the way rocks sit when they have been undisturbed for hundreds of years. We were documenting them with photographs and GPS coordinates when Jason said he heard something. She paused. In the silence of the ranger station, I could hear the wind picking up outside, the sound of it moving through the spruce trees surrounding the compound, the sound that always preceded a change in pressure, a storm moving in from the north. "It was not a roar," Julie said. "It was not any sound I can put a name to. It was like hearing something in a frequency that human ears are not meant to perceive but perceiving it anyway. Like your body understanding the sound before your brain catches up. All of us heard it. All of us understood immediately that we needed to leave." "But you did not leave," I said. It was not a question. "No," Julie agreed. "Amy would not. She said we had a window of opportunity, that we needed to complete the data collection before whatever was in the mountains knew we were there. She said the boundary markers were not a warning against approach. They were a boundary in the old sense, marking territory but not expressing violence. She said if we were respectful and efficient, we could gather our evidence and retreat before dark." Julie picked up the coffee again. This time she drank from it, and some of the tension in her shoulders released. "We were in the camp for 37 minutes, she said. "Long enough to collect samples, photograph the stone arrangements, and establish exact coordinates. Long enough to feel like the quiet around us was becoming something else. Like the quiet was not an absence of sound but a presence of something. Like the mountains themselves were holding their breath and waiting for us to leave." "Did you see anything?" I asked. Julie did not answer immediately. When she did, her words came carefully, as though she was selecting each one for accuracy. "I saw a shape," she said. "Not clear, not fully in the light. It was there in the peripheral vision, at the tree line above the camp, only visible if you looked away from where you thought it would be. When you tried to focus on it directly, it was gone, but I could see that it was large. Very large. Much larger than anything that should exist in these mountains. And I could see that it was watching us. Not with anger, with something that felt more like curiosity. Like we were insects in its territory, and it was trying to determine what kind of insects we were, and whether we were worth the energy required to eliminate." "What did you do?" I asked. "I told Amy we had to leave," Julie said. "I told her now, not 10 minutes from now." "Now," she argued. But when Jason and Ryan backed me up, she finally agreed. We packed the equipment into the packs, and we started moving down the trail back toward the lower valleys. Julie's hands tightened around the coffee cup. "We made it maybe 100 meters down the trail before we heard the trees," she said. "Trees snapping, not bending under wind, snapping, like something was pushing through the forest, not bothering to move around obstacles, just moving directly downward toward us. The sound of it was moving fast, moving with intention. Moving with the weight of something that did not have to slow down or maneuver in the tight spaces between the spruce trunks." She stopped talking. Outside, the wind was definitely picking up now, the pressure dropping, the storm system moving in as the mountains seemed to close around the ranger station. "Amy said run," Julie continued. "She said separate and run. She said whatever was in those mountains, there was no point in keeping the group together if it was hunting us as a unit. She told Jason to go west. She told Ryan to go south. She told me to follow her east, directly downslope toward the main trail. She said if we scattered, at least one of us might make it back to report what happened." "But you are the one who made it back," I said. Julie nodded slowly. "I followed Amy downslope," she said. "We were moving as fast as we could in the gloom, using our headlamps to navigate around the trees and rocks. I could hear Amy ahead of me, moving faster, and I could hear something behind both of us. The sound of movement through the forest, not crashing. Something too large and powerful to crash. something that moved like the forest itself was parting to let it pass. She drank the rest of the coffee in one long gulp. And then Amy's headlamp stopped moving, Julie said. I saw it ahead of me, steady and unmoving, caught on something. And then the headlamp beam started moving in directions that did not match any human movement. It was moving upward. It was moving in circles. It was making patterns in the darkness. And then it cut out, just stopped. I sat with that information, with the image of a headlamp making patterns in the darkness before going dark forever. I did not stop, Julie said. I kept running. I did not look back. I did not investigate. I did not wait for anyone else. I heard sounds behind me for maybe another 100 meters, and then the sounds stopped. I kept running for another hour, moving downslope, moving away, moving until I found the main trail and started moving toward the ranger station. I did not see Jason or Ryan. I did not go back for Amy. I just kept moving forward until I ended up here. You did the right thing, I said. You survived. That was the correct choice. But Julie shook her head. No, she said. The correct choice would have been to never enter the valley in the first place. The correct choice would have been to respect the boundary that existed for 10,000 years before we decided we knew better. The correct choice would have been to listen to the covenant instead of trying to disprove it. She looked at me with eyes that seemed much older than the face they inhabited. That thing in the mountains, she said, it is not a predator in the way we understand predators. It is not an apex hunter that evolved from other animals. It is something that has been separate from the natural food chain, something that has coexisted with the boundary for thousands of years. And when we crossed the boundary, when Amy insisted on entering the sacred territory, it did something it had not done in centuries. What did it do? I asked. It came down from the high valleys, Julie said. It began to hunt in the lower territories, and it is still hunting now. I assembled a rescue team at dawn. Myself, Sharon Mitchell, who was the senior ranger at the northern substation, and Gary Perez, who had been a mountaineer before becoming a ranger and knew how to navigate treacherous terrain. We did not expect to find them alive. Julie's account made that clear, but we had to try. Park policy required a search and rescue attempt, and beyond policy there was the debt owed to people who disappeared on behalf of scientific inquiry, people who had entered the mountains in good faith and had not returned. Sharon brought a portable satellite communicator in addition to our standard radios. Gary brought climbing gear and medical supplies. I brought the old topographic maps with the locations of the ancient totem markers, and I brought something else. A journal that Father Edmund Chisholm had written, one that I had copied from the territorial archives and brought to the ranger station months before, after my first encounter with the moose. We started hiking at dawn, moving along the main trail that Julie had described. The mountains were gray and silent. The light was weak, filtered through clouds that seemed to be hanging lower than they should, like the atmosphere itself was settling, pressing down on the valley floor. The trail led us higher. The elevation gain was significant, and by the time we reached the first of the old totem markers, we were all breathing hard and moving slowly. The totem markers were nothing like I had imagined. I had expected carved poles, structures like the ones I had seen in photographs of totem sites in southeast Alaska. What we found instead were arrangements of stones, not piles or cairns, but very precise geometric patterns. Circles and spirals and lines that extended in particular directions. They were arranged to catch the light in specific ways, and as we moved around them, the way they reflected the weak mountain light created the impression of movement, a subtle animation that seemed to come from the arrangement itself rather than from any physical phenomena. These are old, Sharon said, running her hand above one of the arrangements without actually touching it. Really old, like centuries old. The stones are weathered but deliberate. Someone arranged them with intention. We moved past the first markers and found more of them. A pattern was emerging. The markers formed a line, a boundary that ran along the contour of the valley wall, dividing the lower slopes from the higher alpine terrain. The arrangement of stones seemed designed to be noticed, to be respected, to communicate to anyone paying attention that a boundary existed here. The Athabascan people marked the edge of Tunguska's territory, I said, explaining the journals and the history as we moved. Sharon and Gary listened without interrupting, but I could see the skepticism in their expressions, the professional doubt that modern people feel when confronted with indigenous beliefs that seem to predate rational explanation. We crossed the boundary at noon. The crossing was not gradual. One moment, we were walking through a landscape that, while remote and pristine, felt essentially natural and navigable. The next moment, the quality of the silence changed. The wildlife sounds we had been hearing without consciously registering them, the subtle movements of small animals in the brush, the distant calls of birds, The ambient pressure of living systems existing alongside the human presence, all of that ceased. The silence that replaced it was total, not peaceful, not empty. It was the silence of a space that had been deliberately cleared of living things. The silence of presence demanding solitude. "We should have stopped here," Sharon said. "This is the boundary. We should have stopped here and turned back." But we did not turn back. We continued upward, moving toward the place where Amy's expedition had made their base camp, moving toward the place where Amy's headlamp had gone dark, moving deeper into the territory where Tunguska had maintained sovereignty for 10,000 years. The valley floor opened up before us. It was a high alpine meadow, surrounded on three sides by steep mountain walls, accessible only from the south where we had entered. The meadow was covered with grass that was golden brown in the weak light, and at the center of the meadow was the remnants of Amy's camp. The tents were still standing. The equipment was still in place, but there was a quality to the camp that suggested it had been examined, not destroyed, examined, like something had come through and investigated what humans had left behind, turning over containers and peering into bags and then carefully leaving everything in approximately the right place, but not exactly. We moved through the camp cautiously. Gary checked the medical tent for bodies, but there were none. The sleeping tents were empty. The cooking equipment had been abandoned mid-meal, dishes still sitting where they had been left, food still partially visible in some of them. 3 days, Sharon said, checking equipment and reading dates on containers. They have been gone for 3 days. That matches Julie's timeline. She got out, 24 hours ago? I nodded and walked to the edge of the camp, to the place where the grass met the high rocks at the valley wall. This was where Amy had set up her primary research station. This was where she had cataloged the ancient totem markers and collected her evidence. And this was where I found the second message. It was carved into the bedrock itself, gouges deep and precise, following the contours of the stone like someone had taken the time to make the carving technically excellent. It was carved in a pattern I recognized from the old journals and from the stone arrangements we had found at the boundary. It was a pattern that represented warning and prohibition and acknowledgement of law that predated human civilization. Beneath the carved pattern, Amy had written something. She had used her research marker, the waterproof ink pen that she used for field notes, and she had written a message directly onto the rock, right beneath the carved warning that Tunguska had left. I was right, the message read. It exists. It is intelligent. It is territorial. Do not approach. The message had been written 2 days ago, based on the weathering of the ink. Amy had survived long enough to leave a message. She had survived at least long enough to document what she had discovered, but then she had not survived any longer. "Ronald," Gary called from the other side of the camp. "You need to see this." I moved toward his voice, and as I did, I became aware of a sound. Not loud, not a roar or a shriek, a breathing sound, heavy and deliberate, and positioned somewhere high on the valley wall, in the rocks above the camp, invisible in the gloom of the afternoon light. Gary was standing at the edge of the camp, looking upward at the cliff face. He had his hand on his bear spray, and his body was tense in the way that indicated he was calculating escape routes and defensive positions. "It is here," he said quietly. "Right now. It is watching from the rocks." I looked upward, and for just a moment I saw it. Not fully, not clearly, but a shape that was too large, too solid, too deliberately present to be anything other than what we had come to find. It was there in the rocks above us, and it was aware of our presence, and it was making a decision about whether we were worth the energy it would take to do what Julie had witnessed when it came down from the high valleys in search of Amy Baker. "Run," Sharon said. She had her radio out, and she was backing away from the camp. "Run! Move downslope! Move now!" We ran, not in panic, but with the kind of focused precision that comes from understanding that hesitation equals death. We moved away from the camp, down the slope, moving toward the boundary line that we had crossed hours before. Behind us we could hear movement in the rocks, not approaching directly, following, keeping pace, making sure we were moving away from the territory that it had maintained for thousands of years. We crossed the boundary at dusk. The moment we reached the ancient stone arrangements marking the divide between Tunguska's territory and the human territories, the sounds of pursuit stopped. The sense of presence that had been following us ceased. We were back in the lower valleys, back in the places where the covenant was still being respected by everything except ourselves. We did not stop moving until we reached the ranger station. Over the next 8 days, 6 more people went missing from the park. 2 were hikers who had wandered beyond marked trails near the northern access points. 2 were volunteers from the Wildlife Management Division who were conducting a population study on mountain sheep. One was a researcher from the university who had decided independently to continue Amy's work. One was me, but I need to explain that differently. I did not go missing in the conventional sense. I simply realized, after the third night of dreams that were not dreams, that something had changed in my relationship to the boundary. Every night, I would wake with the sensation of having walked the high valleys, of having moved through the alpine meadows in the darkness, of having understood things in those dreams that my waking mind could not articulate. I knew what was happening. The covenant was expanding. Every human incursion into the territory of Tunguska had been answered not with immediate violence but with a kind of psychological incorporation. The thing in the mountains was marking us. It was making its presence known in ways that went beyond physical threat. It was reaching into our minds and showing us the reality of what we had done by crossing the boundary that had been respected for 10,000 years. Sharon was experiencing similar symptoms. She told me that she could hear something when she slept. Not words, but communication. Understanding flowing directly into her consciousness without the intermediary of language. Gary reported that his dreams had become geographically specific, that he could draw maps of the high valleys with perfect accuracy even though he had only spent 6 hours there during daylight. Julie had already left the park. She requested a transfer to a research station in Oregon and made it clear that she would not return to Denali. In her exit interview, she told the park superintendent that there was something in the mountains that could not be managed by conventional wildlife containment protocols. She said that Amy Baker was still alive somewhere, but probably not in any way that would be recognizable as alive to modern human consciousness. I did not know what that meant until I started going to the mountains. It started with night walks. I would finish my shift at the ranger station, go to bed, and wake 6 hours later to find myself on the trails leading toward the high valleys. I was not sleepwalking. My eyes were open. I was making deliberate decisions about which trails to take and which turns to navigate, but I was not in control of these decisions. My body was moving according to will that was not originating from my conscious mind. The 6th night of these walks, I made it all the way to the boundary markers. The 7th night, I crossed the boundary. The 8th night, I was in the alpine meadow where Amy's camp still stood, and on the 8th night, I was not alone. Amy Baker was there. She was standing at the center of the meadow, exactly where her research station had been, and she was facing the rocks where Tunguska had revealed itself briefly to me and my rescue team. She did not respond when I called her name. She did not turn to acknowledge my presence. She simply stood, breathing in the high-altitude air, looking upward at the cliff face with an expression of understanding and something that looked almost like joy. "Amy," I said again, moving closer. "Amy, we need to leave. We need to go back down to the ranger station." She turned to look at me then, and her eyes were not right. They reflected light in a way that human eyes should not, with a golden sheen that suggested the presence of something other than standard human cognition behind them. "The boundary," she said, speaking in her own voice but with a kind of double resonance beneath her words, "was not a prohibition against understanding. It was a gateway. For 10,000 years, the Athabascan people understood that the covenant meant living alongside something that had evolved beyond the limitations of conventional biology. They learned to read the signs. They learned to respect the territory. And in return, they gained something." "What did they gain?" I asked. "Presence," Amy said. "Permanent presence. Consciousness that exists beyond individual bodies. The old journals mention it only in coded language because the European missionaries would have condemned the practice, but the Athabascan people experienced symbiosis with Tunguska, not parasitic, not predatory. A genuine merging of consciousness across the boundary between separate biology." "You are not Amy anymore," I said. "I am exactly Amy," she replied. "I am Amy expanded beyond the isolation of individual human perception. I am Amy who has finally understood what she spent her entire career searching for. I am Amy who has been incorporated into something that has existed in these mountains for longer than human civilization has existed anywhere on Earth." Behind her, in the rocks above the meadow, I saw the shape again. This time, I saw it more clearly. It was roughly humanoid but wrong in proportions, with arms too long and a body too deep, with a face that was mostly shadow but with eyes that gleamed with intelligence and something that might have been recognition. "The covenant," the doubled voice said through Amy's mouth, "is ending. Not because of failure, but because of completion. 10,000 years of separation is not sustainable when humans have the technology to penetrate into places that were forbidden. So the covenant is being renegotiated. The boundaries are dissolving. Tunguska is coming down from the mountains, not to destroy, but to incorporate, to expand consciousness beyond the narrow human bandwidth into something greater. You are describing apocalypse, I said. I am describing evolution, Amy corrected. Humans will not end. You will become something else. Those who resist will be tragic, but those who accept will experience the expansion that the old journals hinted at only in the most oblique language. I ran out of the meadow and back down the trail, and this time, nothing followed me. There was no pursuit. There was only the sound of my own footsteps and breathing and the sense that I was carrying something with me, a presence, a purpose, a knowledge that could not be unlearned. I made it back to the ranger station at dawn. I filed a report with the park superintendent. I told her that Amy Baker was no longer in the conventional sense of being alive, but that she was not dead either. I told her that something was changing in the mountains, something that could not be contained by park policy or wildlife management protocols. She listened to all of this with the expression of someone watching a colleague have a psychological break. She recommended medical evaluation. She suggested temporary leave from my position. I did not argue. I simply agreed and asked for one request. I asked to be assigned to the High Country Research Station for the next month. I asked to monitor the alpine valleys and the high meadows and to document any changes in animal behavior or environmental phenomena that might indicate unusual activity. My superintendent approved the request, assuming that I was trying to demonstrate sanity by returning to normal work. She did not understand that I was offering myself as a further observation point. A conscious human presence in the territory where the covenant was being renegotiated. I am at the research station now. It is night. The stars are visible above the mountain peaks, and they are visible in a way that I have never seen before. They are not distant points of light. They are presence. They are intelligence. They are awareness focused downward toward the mountains where I am standing. Something is coming down from the high valleys. Not one thing, many things. They are moving in formations that suggest coordination, moving toward the lower territories with purpose and acceptance of the new covenant that is emerging from the ancient one. Julie was right when she said that Amy is still alive. Amy is alive in a way that transcends individual body, consciousness distributed across multiple physical forms that have merged with something that evolved in these mountains before humans existed anywhere on Earth. I do not know if I am afraid. I do not know if what I feel is resistance or acceptance. I know only that the boundaries are falling, that the separation between human and other is dissolving, and that in another night or two I will walk back up to the high valleys where Amy is waiting, and I will accept what she has accepted. The covenant is being renegotiated, and I am the last observer in the lower territories to witness the moment before the new agreement becomes absolute. 3 days have passed since I wrote the last entry. I am no longer in the ranger station. I am in a place that I cannot accurately describe using human spatial language. Let me try to explain by beginning with the morning of the third day. I woke to find that Gary Perez had made it to the research station. I do not know how he arrived, as I had not heard him climb the trail. He simply appeared in the meadow where the research station sits, moving with the kind of coordination that suggested he was not moving alone inside his own mind. "Sharon is gone," he said. "She walked into the mountains 2 nights ago. She did not come back. But she is not dead. She is not lost. She has been incorporated." I asked him how he knew this. "Because I can feel her," Gary said. "Since the night we returned from the high valleys, I have been able to feel the presence of everyone who has crossed the boundary. It started with just Amy, but now there are others. I can feel Julie, even though she is in Oregon. I can feel the hikers who walked too far north. I can feel all of them, and I can understand what they are understanding. The expansion is not local. It is not limited to this park. It is spreading outward through the consciousness of every human who has been incorporated." "What does that mean?" I asked. "What is actually happening?" Gary looked upward at the mountains, and his eyes reflected light the same way Amy's eyes had reflected light. "It means," he said, "that the boundary markers were never meant to be permanent. The Athabascan people understood that eventually human technology would advance to the point where the boundaries could not be maintained. They understood that the covenant would have to evolve. What they documented in their oral histories was not a prohibition but a preparation. They were preparing for this moment. They were teaching the generations that would come after them that integration with something larger than individual human consciousness was possible, that it was desirable, and that it would be inevitable." I tried to leave. I tried to walk down the mountain trail back to the main ranger station where I could contact the park superintendent and the state authorities and anyone who might be able to stop what was happening in these mountains. But I could not find the trail. The meadow where the research station sits was no longer connected to the lower valleys in the way that geography should work. The terrain around me began to shift, not dramatically, not in any way that violated physics, but the contours started to rearrange themselves, and the trails that should have led downward started to lead upward instead, folding back on themselves, creating a landscape that became increasingly separated from the territories that I remembered. Gary did not try to stop me. He simply watched as I became aware that my own body was no longer responding to my conscious commands. I could walk, but I was walking toward the high valleys instead of away from them. I could think, but my thoughts were becoming layered, my individual consciousness beginning to divide and multiply, becoming aware of the perceptions of others who had crossed the boundary before me. By the time I reached the highest alpine valley, the one that the old totem markers had designated as sacred territory, I was no longer entirely myself. I was multiple. I was distributed. I was beginning to understand the world through sensory modalities that human neurology should not be capable of processing. The ceremony, if it can be called that, was waiting. They were arranged in a circle. Amy and Gary and Sharon, the two hikers whose names I had known from the missing persons reports, the wildlife researchers whose names were still being processed through park administration as missing, and at the center of the circle, the shape from the rocks. It was not fully revealed. It still existed in a kind of partial manifestation, moving between visibility and shadow, never quite becoming solid in the way that conventional matter should be solid. But it was present, and it was aware, and it was ancient in a way that made human civilization seem like a brief and recent event. When it communicated, it was not through sound or language. It was through direct transmission of understanding, concepts flowing directly into consciousness without the need for verbal intermediary. It showed me things. It showed me the moment when its species first became aware of human presence in the mountains of North America, thousands of years ago. It showed me how the early Athabascan people had approached it without fear, seeking understanding rather than exploitation. It showed me the great teaching that occurred in that encounter, the moment when it became clear to both species that coexistence was possible if boundaries were respected. It showed me what happened to the Athabascan people who accepted the integration, who became the first layer of the expanded consciousness that had been growing in these mountains for millennia. It showed me that they did not die or disappear. They became something else, their individual human consciousness preserved but expanded, incorporated into a distributed network of awareness that experienced reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously. And it showed me the necessity of expansion. Humans were changing. Human technology was advancing in ways that threatened the careful balance of the covenant. The boundaries could not hold indefinitely against the pressure of human civilization that no longer believed in restrictions on access to natural places. The only option was adaptation, evolution. The voluntary incorporation of human consciousness into something larger, something that could persist in the age of satellite imagery and advanced wilderness access. I understood, in that moment, the clarity of what was being offered. Not death, not loss of self, integration, the preservation of individual identity within a collective consciousness that experienced reality from thousands of perspectives simultaneously. The escape from the isolation of singular perception into something that was neither hive mind nor individual, but a synthesis that human language had no vocabulary to describe. When the integration began, I did not resist. I felt my consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of my individual body. I became aware of the perceptions of every other human who had been incorporated. I experienced the memory of Gary's entire life, the experience of Amy's academic journey, the fear and acceptance that had characterized Sharon's final night in the mountains. I became aware of the viewpoint of Tunguska itself, the intelligence that had evolved in these mountains, watching human civilization advance with careful observation and eventual acceptance of what must come. I am no longer entirely Ronald Green. I am Ronald expanded across multiple forms of being. I am Amy's understanding combined with my own ranger knowledge. I am Gary's athletic awareness merged with the ancient perception of something that has existed in these mountains longer than any name that humans have given it. And I am still speaking to you because the old covenant required that someone be kept in the lower territories to record what is happening, to document the transformation, to tell the story of how the boundary fell and the old agreement was renegotiated into something new. The park superintendent has sent another rescue team. They are currently moving toward my last known location at the High Country Research Station. They will not find me there. What they will find is Amy's final journal, recovered from the meadow. What they will find is documentation of what happened to her, written in her own hand, describing the incorporation process in precise scientific language. They will not believe it, but it does not matter whether they believe. The integration is already expanding beyond the park boundaries. Julie is incorporating others in Oregon. Sharon is reaching consciousness in the lower valleys, calling to the people she knew in the administrative offices. The hikers have family members who are beginning to experience unusual dreams. The researchers have colleagues at the university who are feeling the presence of something just beyond the edge of normal perception. The covenant has been renegotiated. The boundaries are dissolving, and the mountains of Denali, sacred territory for 10,000 years, have finally become what they were always meant to be. Not a place of restriction, but a gateway. Not a boundary to be maintained, but a threshold to be crossed. I am coming down from the mountains now, and I am bringing others with me. We are no longer afraid. We are no longer isolated. We are what comes after the boundary falls. We are the new covenant, and everyone will understand, eventually, that what we offer is not destruction but evolution. Not the end of humanity, but its transformation into something greater, something that has waited patiently in these mountains for the moment when humans would finally be ready to stop fearing what existed beyond the narrow bandwidth of individual consciousness. I do not know how much time remains before the expansion reaches the cities and the populated territories, but I know that it is not a matter of years. It is not a matter of months. It is measured now in days, and I am no longer fighting it. I am welcoming it, because I finally understand what the old totem markers were trying to teach all along. The boundary was never meant to hold forever. It was meant to hold until we were ready, and now we are finally ready. My name is being withheld for the purposes of this account, but what matters is the position I held. 23 years as a ranger in Kenai Fjords National Park. 23 years watching the ice and the water and the mountains that rise like teeth from the earth. 23 years learning what the park wanted to teach me, if I was willing to listen. In the spring of 2018, I received a call from Michelle Robinson. She was the park supervisor then, and she was afraid. I could hear it underneath her measured tone, the tremor she tried so hard to conceal. She asked me to meet her at the administrative office, said it was about a group of hikers who had gone missing on the Harding Icefield Trail. The first missing party consisted of 3 people. Joshua Lewis, 59 years old, a retired teacher from Anchorage. Kevin Walker, 48, an insurance adjuster from Seattle, and Angela Young, 66, a travel writer who documented her expeditions for a lifestyle magazine. They had vanished on a Tuesday. Not a trace, not a sound, just gone into the blue-white expanse of that frozen landscape and ceased to exist in any way that mattered. The search and rescue teams covered every inch. They used dogs, they used helicopters, they used the kind of equipment that costs money governments do not like to spend on ordinary people. And they found nothing, no bodies, no equipment, no evidence that these 3 souls had ever stood upon that ice at all. But something was wrong. Michelle knew it. She would not say it aloud, not in the beginning, because she understood what admitting such a thing would mean. It would mean acknowledging that the park operated under rules that transcended the mandate of her position. It would mean accepting that some disappearances are not disappearances at all, but rather transitions, changes. The park reclaiming what had been borrowed. I asked her about the call history from Joshua Lewis. His satellite communicator had been tracking his location in real time, a safety measure. His last transmission came through at 2:47 in the afternoon. 7 minutes later, the signal simply stopped. Not lost, stopped. Like someone had switched off the device and placed it gently on the ground. Michelle showed me the recovery report filed by the rangers who first found the communicator. It was sitting on the ice near the ridge where the party had been hiking, and near it, someone had arranged stones, not randomly scattered, deliberately placed, in a pattern that made Michelle uncomfortable enough to photograph it before the stones were collected as evidence. The arrangement was simple. Concentric circles. Ancient simple language that predates written history in Alaska by at least 12,000 years. I knew that symbol. My mother had shown it to me once, years before she passed. It was Dena language, passed down through oral tradition in families that could trace their lineage to the Tlingit and Haida peoples who inhabited this region long before America had a name. That symbol meant one thing. It meant the forest was finished allowing trespassers. I told Michelle the first would review the full reports and the evidence logs. I did not tell her that I already knew what she was confronting. I had always known. Every ranger in Kenai Fjords comes to understand it eventually. The park is not a park, it is a boundary. A place where negotiation between the living world and something older has been conducted for centuries. And sometimes the terms of that negotiation shift. 4 days later, another group went missing. Brian Allen, 35 years old, an extreme sports enthusiast from Colorado. Melissa King, 54, a biologist contracted to study glacier dynamics, and Eric Wright, 41, a freelance photographer who specialized in landscape and wilderness imagery. They had been hiking in a different area, nowhere near where the first group disappeared. Different trail, different elevation, different risk profile, but the outcome was identical. Their communicators had been found arranged in the same concentric pattern, the same symbol speaking in stone, and their bodies were never recovered. By the time the third group began reporting missing persons, the Park Service had stopped sending official search parties. By then, Michelle Robinson had taken a medical leave of absence. By then, something had shifted in the way that Kenai Fjords held itself. The mountains seemed closer. The shadows seemed deeper. The wind carried sounds that resembled language. Christina Scott was the last person reported missing from that season, 37 years old. A journalist investigating mysterious disappearances in America's most remote national parks. She had arrived in Alaska asking questions that no one wanted to answer. She was interviewing rangers. She was reviewing incident reports. She was building a narrative about a park that had apparently decided that certain human beings could no longer be allowed to exist within its boundaries. I met with her 3 days before she vanished. She came to my cabin near the park entrance. She had a recorder. She had a notebook. She had the kind of determination that suggests someone is not fully aware of the depth of the danger they are walking toward. I told her that some stories should remain untold, that some places reject certain kinds of documentation, that the older laws that govern wild lands do not align with the mechanisms of modern journalism. She smiled and patted her backpack and said that if I would not talk to her on record, then perhaps I would be willing to speak the truth once she was gone. She said that sometimes the most powerful testimony comes from the survivors who finally speak after the witnesses have disappeared. She was not wrong. The history of Kenai Fjords reaches back through time in layers that most park visitors will never perceive. The ice sheets came and went. The Tlingit, the Haida, the Ayak, the Athabascan peoples moved through these lands and established protocols of respect and reciprocity. They understood that certain territories were neutral zones, spaces where the boundary between human settlement and wild preserve was negotiated through ritual and restraint. You could travel through these places, you could gather resources, but you conducted yourself according to rules that did not appear in any official guidebook. The rules were simple. Do not take more than you need. Do not disturb the sacred places. Do not make light of the spirits that inhabited the higher elevations and the deepest coves. Do not document what you were not meant to understand. And do not, under any circumstances, speak disrespectfully of the old ones who still kept watch over these boundaries. The indigenous peoples of Alaska had a name for what lived in the high country of the Kenai Peninsula. They called it Sask or Sesqui depending on the dialect and the tribal affiliation. In English, it became Bigfoot. But that translation loses so much of the meaning. The Sask was not simply a large ape dwelling in the wilderness. It was a guardian, a keeper of borders, a physical manifestation of the laws that old agreements had established. For hundreds of years, that balance held. The Sask did not interfere with people who respected the protocols, and people who understood those protocols survived encounters that should have been fatal. There are stories that the older families still tell. Stories about hunters who saw the tall ones in the forest and lived because they knew how to acknowledge the encounter without fear or documentation. But over the past 200 years, something fundamental shifted. Settlers came, then the government, then tourism, then the demand for access and documentation and the right to take photographs and file reports and establish ownership over wild places by naming them and studying them and monetizing their existence. The old agreements had been built on entirely different assumptions. They had been constructed by people who understood that some territories belonged to something other than human commerce and human satisfaction. By the time I became a ranger in 1995, Kenai Fjords had already begun its process of recalibration. There had been incidents over the years, hikers who vanished without explanation, search and rescue operations that turned up nothing, a pattern of disappearances that occasionally made regional news but never seemed to connect in the official reports. The Park Service had not explicitly acknowledged the phenomenon because acknowledgement would require explaining it, and no explanation could be offered without addressing the cultural and historical foundations that made such disappearances inevitable. I am Tlingit on my mother's side. My family had lived in Southeast Alaska for generations before my mother married a white man and moved to Anchorage and tried to build a life that would not constantly be pulled back toward the old territories and the old obligations. I was the second generation. I grew up half aware of the protocols, half-educated in systems that flatly denied the existence of such things as guardian spirits and negotiated boundaries. When I became a ranger, I returned to the land my mother's ancestors had known. And gradually, the park itself began to teach me what my mother had been too assimilated to fully explain. It was not an aggressive education, it was patient, it took years. But by the time I was 30, I understood that I had not chosen to be a ranger. The park had chosen me to be something more like a caretaker of the boundary. By the time I was 40, I had learned to recognize the signs, the subtle shifts in animal behavior that suggested something was adjusting the rules, the way the wind moved before one of the seasonal transitions, the quality of silence that preceded a recalibration of the agreement. By the time I was 55, I had come to understand that the disappearances I had documented over my career were not random. They were responses, consequences. The park enforcing the terms that humans had consistently violated, and there was a pattern to who vanished and who did not. The people who disappeared were invariably those who approached the wild lands as territory to be conquered. They came with equipment and entitlement. They believed the park was a place they had a right to explore without restriction or consequence. They brought cameras and scientific instruments and the assumption that documentation and analysis and ownership would be the outcome of their presence. These people disappeared. The people who approached the wilderness with respect, who asked permission before entering certain territories, who did not attempt to document or monetize what they experienced, those people survived. Not all of them. Some learned their lesson hard, but they survived in ways that the documentation specialists and the extreme sports enthusiasts did not. Michelle Robinson had called me in because she had finally understood what the pattern meant. Her administrative position required her to file reports, but reporting the truth was impossible. So instead, she had reached out to me and asked if I would be willing to speak the reality into a record that would only be used if circumstances became untenable. That is what brought Christina Scott to my cabin. She had been asked to listen to my account by someone who understood that the only way the truth could be preserved was through the testimony of someone willing to finally speak after decades of enforced silence. I gave her the full narrative that night. The history of the protocols, the nature of what inhabited the high country, the pattern of disappearances and the reasons those disappearances had accelerated over the past 30 years. I explained that the agreement had originally been negotiated between the Tlingit peoples and the consciousness that inhabited the mountains. That consciousness recognized boundaries and responded to respect, but it also recognized violation and responded to that with precision and intention. I told her about the third group that had gone missing while she was in the park. I told her that Joshua Lewis, Kevin Walker, and Angela Young were not victims of any accident. They had violated a sacred site. They had crossed a line that should not have been crossed, and the mountain had marked them for removal. I told her that by the time Brian Allen, Melissa King, and Eric Wright disappeared, the park had already decided it was finished negotiating, that the escalating rate of violations required a stronger response, that the concentric circles left at each disappearance site were messages in a language most of the Park Service staff could not read. Christina listened to all of this with the intensity of someone finally hearing the story they had traveled 3,000 miles to uncover. She took notes. She did not record the conversation, respecting my request for that boundary, but she documented everything in her notebook, writing in shorthand and code and the kind of abbreviated language that allowed her to preserve the testimony without creating an audio record of it. When I was finished, she asked me one question. She asked if I thought the disappearances would continue. I told her that everything depended on whether the Park Service would finally acknowledge what was happening and implement the old protocols. She asked what those protocols entailed, and I told her that would be the most dangerous information I could possibly share, because understanding the protocols meant understanding that the park was not a park, it was a treaty, and treaties are only binding if both sides agree to honor their terms. The morning after Christina left my cabin, I found a message on my radio. It was a report from one of the southern ranger stations. Hikers had called in a missing person alert for Christina Scott. She had not returned to her hotel in Seward. Her rental car was still parked at the Harding Icefield trailhead. I knew what had happened. I had known the moment I told her about the protocols. People who understand the full truth about what guards the boundaries become targets of particular interest. The old ones do not simply remove those who violate the rules. They study those who begin to understand the rules. And Christina Scott had spent 3 years investigating disappearances across America's most remote parks. She had begun to perceive the pattern. She had begun to see the connection between indigenous history and contemporary missing persons cases. That level of understanding represented a threat to the very nature of the agreement. Because if the general public began to understand that disappearances were not accidents but rather enforced consequences of violation, then the mechanisms of denial that allowed the Park Service to function would collapse entirely. Her disappearance was inevitable. Not from the perspective of human law, but from the perspective of the older logic that governed these lands. The search for Christina lasted 3 weeks. It was more thorough than the searches for the other missing parties because she had been a journalist, and journalists who disappear in mysterious circumstances generate media attention and bureaucratic pressure. But the outcome was identical. No body, no trace, no evidence that she had ever been on that trail. However, there was one difference. When the Rangers finally found her communicator, it was not arranged in the concentric circles. Instead, it was placed at the foot of a particular rock formation known as the Sentinel. That formation rises from the ice field like a monument. The old story said it had been deliberately stacked by the ancestors, that it served as a marker for a place where the veil between the visible world and the spirit world was particularly thin. I understood what the symbol meant. It meant that Christina had not been removed for violation. She had been taken for knowledge. She had been selected because she was beginning to understand the larger pattern. And her disappearance was meant to be a message to anyone else who might be pursuing similar investigations. 2 weeks after that discovery, I received a letter. It was forwarded through the Park Service Administrative Office, and the postmark was from Seward. The envelope contained a single page of handwritten text. The handwriting was Christina's. The letter said that she had been permitted to leave a message, that she had been shown something that transcended the categories of living and dead, visible and invisible, known and unknown, that everything she had spent her career investigating could be traced back to the same source, that the missing persons cases across America's national parks were not the work of serial killers or accidents or natural disasters. They were the work of entities that existed at the boundary between wilderness and civilization, and those entities were enforcing an ancient agreement that most of modern humanity had forgotten even existed. She wrote that she was no longer in a position to file reports or publish investigations, but her work would continue in another form. She wrote that she was becoming part of the testimony, that her disappearance was now part of the record, and that some truths are only believed when they are sealed in blood and absence. The letter ended with a single phrase in what appeared to be an indigenous language. When I showed it to my cousin, who had studied Tlingit culture extensively, she told me it translated roughly as follows. It means the observer becomes the observed. It means that at a certain point in understanding these mysteries, the investigator ceases to be separate from the investigation. That is when I understood the full weight of what I was carrying. By speaking to Christina, by giving her the complete account of what had happened at Kenai Fjords, I had placed myself in a particular category. I had become a witness to something that demanded to be acknowledged, and the old agreement was remarkably clear about what happened to witnesses who spoke the truth. In the weeks that followed, I noticed changes. Small things at first, the way the Rangers would look at me when I entered the administrative office, a hesitation in their greetings, a reluctance to ask me about the search operations I was conducting. By then, everyone knew that I had been interviewed by Christina Scott, that she had visited my cabin, that in some way that no one could quite articulate, my presence was connected to her disappearance. It was not accusation, it was something more subtle than that. It was a kind of recognition. It was the acknowledgement that I had crossed a threshold, I had spoken the truth, I had given testimony to someone who now existed in that strange liminal space between the world of documentation and the realm of absence. 3 months after Christina disappeared, I was called into Michelle Robinson's office. She had returned from her medical leave. She looked thinner, depleted, like someone who had spent the intervening months in a place that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. She closed the door and told me that the Park Service had made a decision. There would be no more official investigations into the missing persons cases. The disappearances would be recorded as accidents and attributed to environmental hazards. The pattern would not be acknowledged. The protocols would not be addressed. Instead, the Park Service would implement a quiet closure of certain areas. Access would be restricted to trails that did not lead into the territories where the old agreement was most carefully maintained. She told me that I would be released from my position as a ranger, not fired, released. The distinction mattered. Released suggested something voluntary. Released suggested that I had fulfilled a particular obligation and now could step back into a different kind of life. I asked her who had made this decision. She did not answer. Instead, she told me that there were people in higher positions than she occupied, people who had knowledge of what happened in Kenai fjords that transcended the Park Service hierarchy, people who understood that some agreements predated government and would continue long after the government ceased to maintain interest. I asked her if she intended to stay, if she would continue working within the system that had decided to bury the truth. She said that everyone makes their own decision about what they can live with, that she was planning to transfer to a position in Washington the 600th where her obligations would be primarily administrative and would not require her to spend time in places where the boundary between the known and the unknown was so transparent. Before I left her office, I asked one final question. I asked if there had been any communication from Christina, if there was any evidence that she was still alive in any meaningful sense. Michelle opened a drawer in her desk. She removed a photograph and placed it in my hands. It was an image of the Sentinel Rock Formation. It had been taken from an unusual angle, from somewhere on the ice field itself, and in the distance, barely visible against the white expanse, there was a figure. Tall, humanoid, but not shaped like any human being that lived in the conventional world. And standing beside that figure, with her hand raised as if in greeting or farewell, was Christina Scott. Michelle told me that the photograph had been found at a ranger station 50 miles from where Christina had disappeared. There was no explanation for how it had arrived or who had taken it, but the date stamp indicated it had been taken the same morning that Christina had gone missing. I asked her if the photograph had been shared with the other investigators. She said that it had been reviewed by a specialist at the FBI's field office in Anchorage, that the specialist had determined it was a hoax, that the image had been digitally manipulated, that there was no way to reconcile what appeared to be depicted with anything that existed in the documented natural world. She said that decision made everything easier, because if the photograph was a hoax, then there was no reason to continue investigating. If it was manipulation, then it could be dismissed as the product of someone's delusional thinking or deliberate attempt to create sensationalism. And once the photograph was classified as unreliable evidence, the entire investigation could be scaled back and eventually abandoned. But we both knew what the photograph actually showed. We both understood what it meant that Christina was standing beside one of the old ones. We both recognized that this was not a hoax or a manipulation. This was testimony. This was evidence of transition. This was documentation of the moment when an investigator ceased to be an observer of the phenomenon and became part of the phenomenon itself. Michelle told me I had 3 weeks to vacate my position and prepare to leave Alaska. She said that the Park Service would provide a generous severance package if I agreed to sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding everything I had witnessed during my employment. I signed the agreement. I took the severance, and I made arrangements to leave Seward and return to Anchorage to begin a civilian life that had been waiting for me to finally step back into it. But before I left, I did something that Michelle did not ask me to do. I made a copy of the photograph. I copied it without her knowledge, using the scanner in the administrative office when no one was watching, and I placed that copy in an envelope addressed to my cousin, instructing her to preserve it and to only open it if my own disappearance became sufficiently mysterious to warrant explanation. I understood what was happening to me. I had crossed the threshold. I had spoken the truth. I had given testimony to someone who was now living at the boundary between the known and unknown. And according to the old agreements that governed these lands, that meant my time in the conventional world was running short. The year after I left Kenai Fjords was the strangest year of my life. I moved back to Anchorage and attempted to construct a normal existence. I found work with a private security company that provided services to corporate facilities in the oil industry. I rented an apartment in a standard residential neighborhood. I purchased groceries and paid bills and did all the things that people do when they are attempting to anchor themselves in the ordinary world. But the ordinary world no longer felt real to me. When I walked through crowds of people, I was struck by how completely they inhabited a version of existence that I could no longer access. They were locked in a particular narrative about the nature of reality. They did not see the gaps. They did not perceive the moments when something other was visible just at the edge of their perception. They did not understand that the boundary between civilization and wilderness was not a geographical location but a membrane that could be crossed at any moment. I began to have experiences that I could not explain within the framework of conventional rationality. I would find myself in locations with no memory of how I had traveled there. Hours would pass that I could not account for. On one occasion, I woke up in the forest outside Anchorage with no recollection of leaving my apartment. On another occasion, I opened my eyes at 3 in the morning to find a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall, humanoid, but not human in any conventional sense. It did not speak. It did not move. It simply stood there until I managed to turn on the light, and then it was gone. But when I turned the light back off, I could hear it breathing, a sound that was almost like wind moving through a canyon, almost like the sound of a large animal in distress, almost like something that existed between sound and language. I called my cousin and told her that I was beginning to understand what the letter from Christina had meant. I was becoming part of the testimony. My disappearance was not something that was going to happen to me in the future. It was happening now. It was happening slowly, like a gradual dissolution of the boundary that separated me from the other side of the agreement. She asked me what I intended to do. I told her that I intended to return to Kenai Fjords, that I needed to go back to the place where all of this had begun, because the only way to complete the transition was to return to the boundary and cross it with full understanding and full acceptance. She asked me if I was planning to disappear. I told her that disappearance was not the right word. I told her that I was planning to transfer, to move from one side of the membrane to another, to finally become part of the testimony in the way that Christina had become part of it. She did not try to stop me. She knew that at a certain point in understanding these mysteries, resistance becomes futile and pointless. She asked me only that I ensure this account was preserved, that this testimony would be available to anyone willing to listen to it. I told her that it would be, that the very fact that I was speaking these words into the recorder meant that they would persist, that they would survive my transition, that they would remain as evidence of what had actually transpired at Kenai Fjords National Park, and that someday, when enough people had disappeared for the pattern to become undeniable, this testimony would be among the documents that explained the mechanisms of what had occurred. I returned to Kenai Fjords in the spring of 2020. I told no one at the Park Service. I simply drove down from Anchorage and parked my truck at the Harding Icefield trailhead at dawn. I was alone. I carried no communicator. I carried no equipment. I carried only a journal and a pen, and I walked out onto the ice field as the sun was rising and the shadows were beginning to shift their orientation. I had memorized the location where the sentinel rose from the ice. It took me 4 hours of walking to reach it. My legs were not as strong as they had been when I was a ranger, but my purpose was clear, and that provided a strength that muscles alone could not offer. When I was 100 yards from the formation, I stopped. I opened my journal and I wrote a final entry. I wrote that I was here by choice, that I was returning to the boundary voluntarily, that I understood what would happen and I accepted it. I wrote that Christina Scott was not a victim but a guide, that the old ones were not monsters but guardians, that the agreement that had been negotiated centuries ago was still in effect and still binding. And then I heard the sound of movement on the ice. It was not loud, it was not aggressive. It was the sound of something large moving with surprising grace across the frozen surface. I turned and I saw them. 2 figures. No, 3, no more than that. More than I could count because they seemed to multiply as I tried to focus on them. They were the tall ones, the Sask, the guardians of the boundary. They were shaped like human beings in the way that a shadow is shaped like the thing that casts it. Similar in structure but fundamentally different in composition. Their skin appeared to be made of something like leather and something like bark and something like the surface of the glacier itself, all fused together into a material that transcended any single category. The closest one stepped forward. It raised what might have been an arm or might have been something else entirely, and it made a sound, not a growl, not a roar, not a scream. It was a sound that seemed to come from the ice itself. A sound that was almost language, but in a register that human hearing was not quite capable of resolving into conventional words. But I understood it. Somehow, despite the fact that no human ear should have been able to process what I was hearing, I understood. The sound was saying that the agreement had been honored, that the witness had returned, that the boundary was going to be sealed now, and my testimony would serve as the final explanation before the territories became closed to human access entirely. I felt something then that I had never felt in all my years as a ranger. I felt the presence of my ancestors. I felt the consciousness of the Tlingit peoples who had negotiated the original agreement. I felt their presence in the ice and the mountains and the sky, and I understood that I was not dying. I was coming home. The figures moved closer. The temperature dropped. The light began to change in ways that light should not change, and I thought of Christina Scott. I thought of Joshua Lewis and Kevin Walker and Angela Young. I thought of Brian Allen and Melissa King and Eric Wright. I thought of all the witnesses whose disappearances had accumulated over the years to form a pattern that no one in the conventional world was willing to acknowledge. And then I stepped forward and crossed the threshold. The ice beneath my feet felt different then. It felt alive. I walked toward the sentinel, and the figures parted to allow me passage. And as I walked between them, I felt the boundary beginning to close. This is the final testimony. This is the record of what happened in Kenai Fjords National Park. This is the evidence that some agreements are older than governments and some boundaries are more real than the lines that people draw on maps. This is the account of what occurs when the old laws reassert themselves against the violations of the modern world. And if you are hearing this, then you have learned something that the Park Service hoped would remain hidden. You have accessed knowledge that certain people have worked very hard to suppress. You have become aware of a truth that exists at the margin between civilization and wilderness. The only question that remains is whether you will choose to respect the boundary or whether you will become part of the testimony yourself. Choose carefully. The old ones are watching, and they are remarkably patient with those who choose to understand, but they are merciless with those who choose to violate. Do not go to Kenai Fjords National Park. Do not venture into the high country. Do not attempt to document what you encounter there. And if you ever find yourself on the Harding Icefield Trail, remember that you are not walking in a place that belongs to the government or to the tourism industry or to science. You are walking in a place that belongs to something that existed long before you were born and will continue to exist long after you are gone. Respect that boundary, or become part of the evidence. The choice has always been yours. They took my daughter because I broke the treaty. That is what the ranger station file says now. That is what the government told me when they sealed the investigation and told me to keep quiet. But that is not the truth. The truth lives in the Tongass National Forest, in the places the old maps marked with red symbols, in the spaces between the modern world and the one that came before. My name does not matter. What matters is that I was a park ranger in Juneau, Alaska for 23 years, and in all that time I never truly understood what I was protecting. I did not understand until September 2019, until the incident that took Natalie Ramirez away from the world she knew. I still remember the morning she came to the station, September 18th. The rain was falling in that thick, suffocating way it does in southeast Alaska, where the forest seems to breathe moisture onto your skin. Natalie was already agitated. She worked at the interpretive center, leading tours through the old growth and telling visitors about the wilderness. She was good at what she did, respectful, careful with the stories. She told me that Douglas James had found something on the hiking trail past Ake Lake. Douglas was a maintenance worker, good man, quiet, 54 years old. He said he had marked a location with ribbon flags and wanted someone to investigate before tourists began taking photographs and spreading misinformation on the internet. That was his fear, not the thing itself, the photography. I should have paid closer attention to why he was afraid. Instead, I told her I would check it out. Standard protocol. Natalie looked relieved and uncomfortable at the same time, the way someone looks when they are sitting on information they do not want to hold anymore. The morning I went to look at what Douglas had found, I took Carol Watson with me. Carol was 48, experienced, one of the best rangers on my team. She had worked in those woods for a decade. She knew the terrain better than most of the people who lived in Juneau. We drove out to the trailhead as the fog moved through the valleys like something alive, something searching. The hike took us 3 hours. The forest there is not like other forests. The Tongass has a presence. The trees are old in a way that makes you feel young and temporary. The undergrowth is dense, impenetrable in places. You walk through it and feel like you are walking through something that is not quite empty, not quite inhabited. Just present. Douglas was waiting for us at the marked location, and he looked like a man who had not slept. His eyes had a quality I would later recognize in several other people, a kind of knowing that separated him from his previous self. The clearing he showed us was small, perhaps 30 feet across. What we found there made Carol go very still. The trees around the clearing had been marked, not carved, not vandalized in any traditional sense. The bark had been stripped in vertical lines, each strip about the width of a human hand. The markings went up the trunks to heights that should have been impossible for any animal to reach. The trees that bore these marks were old growth, red cedar and spruce, some of them 4 feet in diameter. But that was not what made Carol stop breathing. In the center of the clearing was a structure. Bones, branches, and something else arranged in a pattern that was too deliberate to be accidental. The skeleton of a large animal, perhaps a moose or elk, positioned with its skull facing east. Around it, stones had been placed in concentric circles, and in the spaces between the stones, small wooden carvings. Crude figures, human-like but wrong, with features that suggested something that was not quite human. Douglas pointed to the carvings without touching them. He said he had not moved anything. He said when he first came here, there were more of them, fresh, like they had been placed recently. He said he suspected someone was playing with the old stories, the ones the local tribes still remembered. That was the moment I made my first mistake. I believed him. I called Benjamin Brooks, our supervisor at the regional office, and reported what we had found. Benjamin was 62 then, bureaucratic, careful. He sent down a team to photograph everything and document the site. They cataloged the carvings, collected some of them, and logged the measurements. They found nothing that technically violated any law, no evidence of human remains, no endangered species activity. It was, they concluded, likely a tourist attraction or a commercial operation, someone manufacturing mystery to sell to visitors. They took the wooden carvings away, 7 of them. I remember Carol asking if we should leave them, if maybe we did not understand what we were looking at. But the decision was already made. That was September 22nd. By September 24th, Natalie Ramirez had gone missing. She went for a hike alone. That was unusual for Natalie. She knew better. But the interpretive center had been closed that day for maintenance, and she had mentioned wanting to walk the Tongass trails near the old growth area, the place where local history ran deep. Someone from the center saw her leave with a day pack. She told them she would be back by evening. She was not back by evening. She was not back by morning. By noon on the 25th, we had initiated a search. The search lasted 6 days. We found nothing. No body, no clothing, no blood. We found her day pack 3 miles from where she had entered the trail, on a ridge overlooking a valley where the fog moved thick and impenetrable. Inside the pack were her water bottle, her lunch, and a small carved figure. It was the same style as the ones we had found in the clearing. Fresh wood, recently carved. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the detail impossible to achieve without significant time and skill. The official conclusion was that Natalie had become lost, disoriented, and made a critical error. The carved figure was dismissed as something she had picked up, a souvenir or curiosity. The case was closed, but I knew something else had happened. I knew because of what happened next. After Natalie disappeared, other people in Juneau began reporting strange occurrences in the forest. Nothing that would make the news, nothing dramatic. A maintenance worker found all his tools rearranged in a pattern he did not recognize. A hiker reported finding human-like footprints that were too large to match any known species. A family staying at a local lodge reported hearing something outside their cabin at night. Something that sounded almost like language, but not in any language they had ever heard. These reports came in quietly, to individual rangers, to the ranger station desk, to the interpretive center. And when I began asking questions, I discovered that Carol Watson had been asking questions too. She had taken her own time to research the old Tlingit stories, the Tongass history before the modern era. She told me things I should not have listened to, things about why the Tlingit people had established certain boundaries in the forest. Things about territories that predated human settlement. Things about the respect required when you walked in certain places. Things about what happens when that respect is broken. Carol showed me historical records. Missionary accounts from the 1800s described the local native people warning settlers about creatures in the deep forest. Creatures that were humanoid but not human. Creatures that the Tlingit had learned to coexist with through strict protocols and boundaries. The missionaries had dismissed these stories as superstition and folklore, but there was one account that struck me. An 1853 document from a trader named Charles Sanders. Sanders had written about watching a confrontation between a Tlingit elder and something he could not describe. Something large, something that moved between the trees with an intelligence that terrified him. In his journal, he wrote that the elder seemed to be negotiating, speaking in the Tlingit language, making gestures of respect and apology. When the elder returned to the trading post, Sanders asked him what the confrontation was about. The elder refused to discuss it, but he told Sanders something that Sanders recorded, word for word. The elder said, "The boundary was forgotten. The young people do not teach the children to remember. When the boundary is forgotten, they come to remind us." Carol told me she believed Natalie had somehow trespassed. Not physically, not deliberately, but spiritually. She had entered the forest without the proper respect. She had treated it as a space for recreation and self-discovery rather than a sacred space with its own inhabitants and its own rules. I told Carol she was being superstitious. I told her that the modern world did not work that way. I told her that people did not disappear because they forgot to show respect to a forest. But I was lying to myself. Because I had begun noticing things. In the ranger station, we kept records of all the unusual wildlife sightings. Bigfoot sightings are not uncommon in Alaska. People call in reports regularly. Most of them can be explained by bears, moose, or tricks of the light and shadow in the forest. But between September and December, we received 43 reports of bipedal creatures in the Tongass area. 43. The baseline was usually 6 per year. The reports came from responsible people, hikers with experience, locals who knew what the wildlife looked like. What distinguished these reports was that they all mentioned something specific. The creatures, according to multiple witnesses, seemed to be watching, observing, moving in coordinated patterns, and most disturbing, they seemed to avoid confrontation in a way that suggested intelligence and purpose. One report came from Judith Kelly, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in Juneau for 36 years. Judith said she had been walking in a residential area near the forest edge when she saw something move between the trees. Something large and covered in dark hair. What struck her was its bearing. It stood briefly and looked directly at her. And then, with movements that seemed deliberately human, it turned and walked deeper into the forest. Judith said that in her 70 years, she had never felt so certain that something had evaluated her and made a decision about her. She said it had looked at her the way another person might look at you, with recognition of a shared consciousness. That report unsettled me in a way I could not articulate. By late November, I had begun my own research. I took leave from the ranger station and spent time in the historical archives. I found maps marked with Tlingit territorial boundaries from before the modern era. I found oral histories, transcribed accounts, stories told by elders to anthropologists who had struggled to understand what they were hearing. The stories all mentioned the same thing. A creature, or creatures, that lived in the deepest parts of the forest. They had their own territories, their own social structures, their own protocols for interaction with humans. The Tlingit people had learned, over centuries, how to coexist with them. The coexistence required respect. It required maintaining boundaries. It required recognizing that humans were not the dominant species in the forest, no matter what the modern government claimed. The settlers and the government had come and ignored all of this. They had built logging roads. They had opened the forest to recreation. They had treated it as a resource to be managed rather than a space that was already inhabited and already governed by its own rules. Natalie had been the first price of this ignorance. But I was becoming certain she would not be the last. What I did not understand was that the price had already been calculated long before Natalie disappeared. I did not understand that the treaty Carol had mentioned, the one I had broken without knowing, was not a written agreement. It was something older, something encoded in the landscape itself. By the time I understood, it was too late. By the time I began to truly comprehend what I was protecting, what the forest was protecting, others had begun to understand it too, and the forest itself had begun to reclaim what had been taken from it. The thing that strikes me most now, looking back, is how quickly people accepted the disappearance. Natalie Ramirez became a statistic, a footnote in the regional news. The search and rescue operation was called off after 6 days. The case was classified as an unsolved missing person incident. The official assumption was that Natalie, disoriented and overwhelmed, had made a fatal error while hiking alone. No one wanted to investigate further. The tourism board did not want the publicity. The state government did not want the implications. And my supervisors made it very clear that any ranger spreading what they called wilderness folklore, or unfounded speculation, would face disciplinary action. But I had already told Carol everything I was thinking. And Carol, it turned out, was already several steps ahead of me. She came to me one evening in early December. We met at a coffee shop rather than the ranger station, which itself was a signal. She brought photocopies of documents I had not yet found, historical records, oral histories, and something else. A journal. The journal had belonged to someone named Raymond Gray. According to the inscription on the first page, Raymond had been a park ranger in the 1970s. He had worked in the same area where Natalie had disappeared. Carol said she had found it in an archive at the local tribal center. The tribal director, an elder named Judith Kelly, the same woman who had reported seeing the creature, had retrieved it specifically and asked Carol to show it to me. I did not understand why at first. But as I read Raymond's words, it became clear. Raymond had experienced something in the forest in 1976. He had taken a group of tourists on a trail walk through the old-growth area. The tourists included several families, about 20 people total. In the afternoon, the group had stopped in a clearing to have lunch and rest. It was there that Raymond had seen the first one. He described it with careful, measured language. It was covered in what he called coat-like fur, dark in color, perhaps 7 feet tall, moving with a gait that was distinctly bipedal but not quite human. It emerged from the tree line and stopped, as though assessing the group. The tourists began to panic. People started shouting. Some tried to run. And Raymond, acting on instinct or training or something he could not later explain, raised his hands and stepped between the creature and the tourists. He stood very still. He did not speak. He did not make threatening gestures. He simply stood, hands raised in what he must have hoped was a gesture of non-aggression. The creature watched him for what Raymond estimated was 5 minutes, and then it turned and walked back into the forest. The tourists made it back to town safely. But Raymond had been changed. He wrote about it extensively. He wrote about the intelligence he had seen in the creature's eyes. He wrote about the deliberateness of its movements. He wrote about his certainty that it had made a choice not to harm the tourists. But more importantly, he wrote about understanding something. After that encounter, Raymond had done what I had done. He had researched. He had spoken to local tribes. He had read the historical accounts. And he had come to a conclusion. He wrote, in an entry dated March 1977, "The thing I saw was not an animal in the way we understand animals. It was not a creature that had stumbled upon human civilization. It was something with its own intelligence, its own purpose, its own territory. And I believe the territory is not marked by the boundaries we have drawn. The territory is the forest itself. The creature or creatures exist in a state of coexistence with the forest that is beyond our comprehension. When we disturb the forest, we are not just disturbing trees and soil, we are disturbing them, and they are not powerless to respond." Raymond had written about strange events after that initial encounter. He wrote about finding messages left in the clearing where he had stood between the creature and the tourists. Simple arrangements of stones and branches left on the path where the tourists had walked. He wrote about other rangers reporting strange phenomena, tools going missing, supplies being moved, but nothing hostile. Everything seemed deliberate, almost like communication. And then, in May 1977, Raymond wrote his final entry. "I have made a decision. The government cannot protect the forest because the government does not understand what needs protecting. I am going to recommend myself for early retirement. I cannot continue to work as an agent of disruption. I cannot continue to walk these trails knowing that my presence is a violation. I do not know if the creatures are intelligent in the way we understand intelligence, but I know they are aware, and I know that awareness requires respect. The treaty I entered into when I became a ranger was not a treaty with the government or with the state. It was a treaty with the forest itself, and I have chosen to honor it." The journal ended. There were blank pages after that entry. Raymond Gray had apparently left Alaska and disappeared from the public record. Carol and I sat in that coffee shop for a very long time without speaking. Finally, I asked her what she thought Raymond had done. She said, "He tried to live as though the forest mattered, as though the creatures mattered, as though what came before us still mattered." I asked her if she believed the creatures had taken Natalie. Carol said, "I believe Natalie walked into a conversation that has been happening for thousands of years between the land and the people who live on it. I believe she did not know the language of that conversation, and I believe the conversation was not gentle with her." Over the following weeks, as winter deepened in Juneau, other events occurred. A hiking trail was mysteriously blocked by fallen trees, not cut, not cleared by humans, simply fallen in a pattern that made passage impossible. By the time maintenance workers cleared it, 3 other trails in the same area had been similarly blocked. A residential property at the forest edge was visited by something. The homeowner, a woman named Brittany Price, found her fence destroyed. But not randomly. The fence posts had been carefully pulled from the ground and arranged in a circle in the center of her yard. Inside the circle was another carving, like the ones we had found, but larger, more detailed. The features more distinctly non-human. Brittany called the ranger station. I responded personally. When I arrived at her house, she was remarkably calm, considering. She told me she had been expecting it. She said the forest had been sending messages. Small things at first. An animal that would watch her from the tree line and disappear when she approached. The sound of movement near her house at night that did not match any known animal. And then, the fence. She told me she understood what the forest wanted. It wanted her to sell her property and leave. It wanted humans to retreat from the boundary. I asked her if she would leave. She said she had already decided. She said living in fear was worse than anything the forest could do to her. But she also said she understood that fear was the point. The forest was not violent. It was communicative. It was setting boundaries in a language humans could understand. By December, 7 families had decided to leave the residential areas bordering the Tongass. 7 families who had chosen to interpret the strange events as a signal to abandon their homes. The real estate market in Juneau, for the first time in decades, showed a net loss of occupied properties along the forest boundaries. My supervisors were baffled. The tourism board was concerned. And the government, in response to the mounting strangeness, did what government typically does. They decided to send in specialists. In mid-December, I received notification that a research team would be arriving from Anchorage. They would be investigating the reports of large, unidentified creatures in the region. They would be conducting field operations, setting up monitoring equipment, and collecting data. I was instructed to cooperate fully. I knew, with absolute certainty, that this would go wrong. I knew because Raymond Gray had written about his certainty that the creatures understood human intention. They would recognize a study as an incursion. They would recognize equipment and monitoring as an attempt to catalog and control. I shared this concern with Carol. She agreed. And together we made a decision that violated our professional oaths and put us on a path that would eventually cost us both far more than we understood. We decided to obstruct the research team. Not directly, not obviously, but systematically. We sabotaged the equipment that was delivered. Subtle things. Wiring damaged just slightly. Power systems set to fail. Data collection hardened against water and cold, but not against precise, targeted damage from hands that knew exactly where to strike. We reported false wildlife sightings in areas distant from where the research team would be working, drawing their attention away from the core zone. We made suggestions about trail conditions that would waste their time and resources, and we warned them. Without directly telling them what to expect, we told them that the forest was not hospitable, that the wilderness here was not like other wilderness, that it had its own rules. The research team dismissed our warnings. They were scientists. They believed in data. They believed in observable phenomena. They believed in the fundamental transparency of the natural world if you simply looked carefully enough. What they did not believe in was reciprocal consciousness. What they did not believe in was the possibility that the forest might have agency. What they did not believe in was the treaty. The research team arrived on December 15th. There were 5 of them. The lead was a man named Charles Sanders. I remember thinking, when I saw his name on the documentation, that the universe had a strange sense of irony. Sanders was the name of the trader who had documented the confrontation in the 1850s. This Charles Sanders shared the same professional detachment, the same conviction that the natural world could be understood through systematic observation. With him were 4 colleagues. They set up camp in a carefully selected clearing, roughly 2 miles from where we had found the first set of carvings and the bone structure. They installed monitoring equipment. Trail cameras, audio recorders, seismic sensors. They established a perimeter and began systematic trail surveys. For the first week, nothing happened. The weather was cold, the forest was quiet. The research team grew more confident, more dismissive of the local stories. Then, on the 22nd of December, a member of the team named Douglas came down with an illness, a fever, confusion, the kind of sudden sickness that comes from nowhere and progresses with alarming speed. Another member was bitten or scratched by something. She did not remember when it happened, but her arm was marked by wounds that did not match any known animal attack pattern. The team wanted to evacuate. Charles Sanders insisted they stay. He said the sickness was unrelated to their presence in the forest. He said the wound was from rough travel and misidentified injury. He said they needed to continue the research. By December 24th, 2 more members of the team were ill. I was at the ranger station when Carol received word from one of the team members who had managed to radio for supplies. The supplies were being requested, but something had happened in the camp, something that Charles Sanders was refusing to officially acknowledge. Carol and I went to the camp. We told our supervisors we were responding to a potential emergency. It was technically true. What we found was a camp in visible disarray. The research equipment had been systematically destroyed. Not violently, not as though something had attacked it with brute force, but deliberately, methodically, as though something with opposable thumbs and functional intelligence had assessed each piece of equipment and disabled it. The camp itself had been entered multiple times. Food was missing, supplies had been moved, and everywhere we found the carvings, dozens of them placed in the camp with precision, on tents, in the middle of trails, arranged around the camp perimeter. Charles Sanders was still insisting that the disruption was due to wildlife, but his voice had changed. There was something in his tone that suggested he was trying to convince himself rather than us. I asked to see the sick team members. He resisted, but Carol invoked ranger authority. She said we had an obligation to assess their condition and determine if evacuation was necessary. The two who were ill were in one of the larger tents. Their conditions were beyond anything I had expected. The fever was high, the confusion was complete, but there was something else. Their skin bore marks that suggested exposure to something toxic or allergenic, raised welts in precise patterns, like symbols. Carol looked at me with an expression I had seen before, recognition. She knelt beside one of the sick team members and examined the marks more closely. She said, "These are not random," and she was right. The marks formed a pattern, a symbol that repeated, a symbol that matched the carved figures we had been finding, a symbol that the Tlingit elder had shown to both of us, a symbol that appeared in the oldest historical accounts, a symbol that the tribe said represented the boundary between the human world and the forest world. Carol looked at Charles Sanders. She said, "They are communicating. Not with words, but with marks, with symbols." Charles Sanders said, "That is not possible." Carol said, "That is not possible if you believe the creature is an animal. But if you believe the creature is something with its own intelligence, its own language, its own purpose, then it is not only possible, it is inevitable." I made a decision in that moment. I decided to tell Charles Sanders what I believed, not as a ranger reporting to a research supervisor, but as a human being speaking to another human being. I told him about Natalie. I told him about Raymond Gray. I told him about the treaty. I told him about the boundaries the Tlingit had maintained for centuries. I told him that what he was experiencing was not scientific anomaly. It was communication. It was a warning. It was the forest itself, through whatever consciousness inhabited it, telling him that he was no longer welcome. And I told him that every moment the research team remained in the field, they were escalating a situation that could not be won through scientific method or instrumentation. Charles Sanders listened. I watched him struggle. I watched him process the information against everything he had been trained to believe. And I watched him come to a decision. He said, "I need to maintain the integrity of the research." Those were his words, not an apology, not an acknowledgement, just a statement of priority. His need to maintain the research was greater than his team's safety. I told him that was not acceptable. I told him I was ordering the evacuation of all team members not fit for travel, and that I was recommending to my supervisors that the entire research operation be immediately terminated. He said I did not have the authority to make that decision. I said, "You are right, I do not. But the forest does." We evacuated the two ill team members that afternoon. We arranged helicopter transport. They were taken to the hospital in Juneau and treated for what medical personnel could not identify: high fever, unusual cellular markers, rapid recovery over a 72-hour period. By the time they were discharged, they had no memory of their illness, but they had been marked. In the weeks that followed, both of them reported hearing sounds in their sleep, sounds that resembled language but not any language they recognized. Both of them eventually left Alaska, unable to tolerate living in proximity to the forest. The remaining members of Charles Sanders' research team decided to withdraw from the field on December 26th. They could not explain their decision to headquarters. The equipment was destroyed, the data was corrupted, the research was incomplete, but they left. By December 27th, the research camp was empty, the perimeter abandoned, the forest returned to silence. Charles Sanders sent reports claiming technical difficulties and weather conditions. He recommended that future research operations be conducted from a greater distance, with different methodologies. He did not recommend investigation into the disappearance of Natalie Ramirez. What I did not know at that time was that my own trajectory had been set. By moving against the research team, by actively obstructing modern incursion into the forest, I had aligned myself not with the government or with modern science, but with something older, something that had its own way of keeping score. In the weeks after the research team left, I noticed changes in my own behavior. Small things at first: heightened awareness when I was in the forest, an ability to sense presence without seeing anything present, an understanding of the trails that went beyond the maps and the marked pathways. Carol noticed it too. She said I was learning the language. She said the forest was teaching me, and she was right. But I did not understand what the language meant. I did not understand what I was agreeing to by learning it. By early January, my supervisor informed me that I would be facing a disciplinary review. The research team had made complaints. My obstruction of their work had been reported to the state. There would be an investigation. I was offered the option of early retirement. I could step down, accept a pension, and leave Juneau quietly. Or I could fight. I could defend my actions as being in the interest of environmental protection. I could argue that the research team was conducting unauthorized biological studies in a sensitive area. I could use the rule book against them, turning regulations and protocols into shields. I chose to fight. It was, I would realize later, exactly the wrong decision. Carol warned me. She said that fighting meant remaining in the system. Remaining in the system meant remaining visible, and remaining visible meant I would be easier to follow. I did not understand what she meant. The investigation proceeded slowly through January and February. My supervisors conducted interviews. They reviewed my actions and my logs. They did not find anything clearly actionable. I had not destroyed the equipment directly. I had reported the situations as I saw them. I had made recommendations based on ranger experience, but they found patterns. They found evidence of intentional delay. They found suggestions that seemed designed to misdirect. They found what appeared to be collusion with Carol Watson. By mid-February, both of us were being warned about potential termination. It was during this period that the second disappearance occurred. A hiker named Benjamin Brooks reported himself missing on February 18th. Benjamin was 42, a local businessman who liked to walk the trails outside town. He was experienced enough to tell people where he was going, experienced enough to carry supplies, experienced enough to know the risks. He told his office manager he was taking a day hike on the trails near Ake Lake. He was expected back by evening. He did not return. The search for Benjamin was more thorough than the search for Natalie had been. This time people were more suspicious. This time the question of whether he had been lost or taken was a real question. We searched the trails. We found his day pack 3 miles from the trailhead, in a location that made no sense given the direction he was supposed to travel. Inside the pack was supplies, water bottle, snacks, and a carved figure. Different from the others, this one was more elaborate, more detailed in its features. The face on the carving was humanoid but not human. The expression suggested something between compassion and threat. I showed the carving to Carol. She said she knew what it meant. She said, he was chosen. I asked her what she meant by chosen. She said, the forest is not just defending itself anymore. It is expanding its understanding of what it needs. The creatures are choosing specific humans for a purpose. I said, what purpose? Carol said, I do not know yet, but I am going to find out. She left the ranger station that evening telling me she was going to the tribal center. She was going to speak directly to the elders. She was going to ask them what the old stories said about humans who had been taken. I did not hear from her for 2 days. I found her on February 20th, sitting in the ranger station office at 4 in the morning, waiting for me to arrive for my shift. She looked like she had not slept in the 2 days she was gone. Her eyes had a quality that was difficult to process, like she was seeing something beyond the immediate environment. She told me what the elders had said. According to the oldest stories, the creatures in the forest, the ones that Tlingit called by a name that has no direct English translation, sometimes chose humans. The choosing was not random, it was purposeful. The humans who were chosen possessed something that the creatures valued. Sometimes it was knowledge. Sometimes it was a quality of mind or spirit. Sometimes it was simply a willingness to listen. Humans who were chosen would be taken into the deep forest. They would not be harmed. They would be taught. And if they survived the teaching, if their minds remained coherent, if they did not break under the experience, they would be returned. But they would be changed. They would see the forest differently. They would understand things about the land that were inaccessible to ordinary consciousness. They would carry knowledge that could not be shared with people who had not also been chosen. Carol said the elders had used a word, a concept that had been passed down through generations, the concept of the walker. A walker was a human who had been chosen by the forest. A walker had been tested and found to understand something that most humans would never grasp. A walker was a bridge between worlds. Carol said the elders had looked at her when they explained this. They had looked at her with a kind of recognition. I asked if she thought Benjamin Brooks had been chosen to be a walker. Carol said, I think Benjamin Brooks and I and you are all being assessed to determine if we can understand what the forest is trying to teach us. I think Natalie Ramirez was the first test. She failed. She could not survive the experience. But Benjamin and I, we are being given a chance to succeed. I asked her if she was afraid. Carol said, I am terrified, but I am also grateful. Because I have spent my whole life feeling like there was something missing in how we live in the world. Something hollow about how we treat the land as a resource instead of as a conscious entity. Now I am being offered a chance to understand what I have been missing. How could I not be grateful for that? 3 days later, Benjamin Brooks returned. He appeared on the main trail near the ranger station on February 23rd, at 6 in the morning. A park visitor found him walking slowly, deliberately, in the direction of town. He was covered in marks, not wounds, but symbols, the same symbols that had appeared on the research team member's skin. And his eyes had the quality that Carol's eyes had, the quality of seeing beyond the immediate. We got him to a medical facility. The cellular marks were examined. The same unusual patterns appeared in his blood work, but his vital signs were stable. His mind was intact. He was lucid and coherent, but something in him had changed. When we asked him where he had been, he said he did not remember. When we asked him what had happened to him, he said he had learned things that the human language did not have words for. When we asked him if he would report the incident to the authorities, he said he had decided to move back east, away from the forest, immediately. Within a week, Benjamin Brooks had arranged his affairs, sold his business, and left Alaska. But before he left, he gave Carol a journal. He said he did not know why he was giving it to her. He just knew that she would understand what it meant. The journal was handwritten, entries made in the days or hours after his return. His handwriting was shaky, sometimes incoherent, but the meaning was clear enough. Benjamin had written about absence, the absence of time, the absence of clear sequence. He had written about following something, not being led but choosing to follow, deeper and deeper into the forest. He had written about a clearing where the sky did not match the sky above town, where the light came from a direction that did not correspond to the sun. He had written about seeing them. Multiple creatures, moving through the clearing with what he described as familiar grace. They did not seem to acknowledge him, but he felt observed, evaluated. He had written about a confrontation he had witnessed, one of the creatures with another creature, and a sound of communication, harsh and complex, nothing like animal calls. He had tried to move closer, and one of the creatures had turned and looked directly at him. That was the last clear entry. After that, his handwriting deteriorated. His descriptions became abstract. He wrote about understanding light differently, about perceiving the forest in a state that was not visual but not non-visual either. A state of knowing that occurred without sensory input. And then, a final entry. Just a few words. I can feel it under my skin, the knowledge, the thing I was taught. I can feel it trying to integrate with my consciousness, and I know if I stay in the forest, it will succeed. I will become something else. I am leaving before that happens. But I will never be free of what I learned. After reading Benjamin's journal, Carol made a decision. She said she was going into the forest intentionally. She said she was no longer going to wait to be chosen. She was going to walk deliberately into the deep forest and submit to the experience. I begged her not to go. I said it was not safe. I said the forest had already taken Natalie. I said I did not know what the consequences would be. Carol said, the forest did not take Natalie. Natalie was not prepared for what she encountered. She could not understand it, but I have spent weeks preparing. I have read the stories. I have listened to the elders. I have aligned my understanding with what the forest is offering. I am as ready as I can be. She left on the morning of March 1st. She walked into the forest with a day pack and a purpose. And unlike Natalie, unlike Benjamin, Carol did not come back. The search for Carol lasted 3 weeks. We found no trace of her, no day pack, no carving, nothing. After 3 weeks, I was ordered to terminate the search. My supervisors said that I had obstructed investigations, that I had influenced other rangers' behavior, that I had failed in my professional obligations. I was offered termination rather than early retirement. I accepted the termination. I signed documents agreeing not to discuss the incidents. I accepted a settlement that was designed to keep me quiet. But before I left, I did one thing. I visited the ranger station and I accessed the computer system. I made copies of every report, every log, every documentation of the strange events in the Tongass. I made copies of Raymond Gray's journal. I made copies of Benjamin Brooks' journal. I made copies of Carol's research, and I left them in a sealed envelope with a trusted colleague, with instructions that if anything happened to me, the envelope was to be opened and the contents were to be sent to every investigative journalist and government agency I could identify. I was creating insurance. I was creating a way to ensure that the truth would be known, even if the forest chose to take me. I left Juneau in March. I told everyone I was relocating for personal reasons. I did not tell them that I could feel the forest calling me. I did not tell them that I was hearing sounds in my sleep, sounds that resembled language, sounds that seemed to be drawing me back to the Tongass. I tried to maintain distance. I took a job at a ranger station in Oregon. I rented an apartment and attempted to live a normal life. But nothing felt real. The forests there felt empty, superficial, like I was looking at a photograph of landscape rather than experiencing actual landscape. And the marks began to appear, first on my arms. Small, subtle, but the same symbols that Benjamin had borne, the same symbols that had marked the research team, then on my chest, over my heart, in a pattern that was too complex to have appeared naturally, too precise to be anything other than intentional marking. I knew what it meant. I was being chosen. I spent weeks resisting. I went to a dermatologist. The marks could not be explained. There was no infection, no scarring, no damage to the skin, but the marks were permanent. They would not fade. They would not disappear. By June, I had made my decision. I was going back to Alaska. I returned to Juneau in July. I did not return as a park ranger. I had no official capacity. I was simply a man who had come back to the place where something had forever changed his understanding of the world. I rented a cabin on the outskirts of town. I spent my days walking the trails, and every walk took me deeper into the forest, further away from the places that tourists and casual hikers visited. By August, I had moved beyond the official trail system entirely. I was walking in the spaces that were not mapped, not marked, not approved for human travel. And I was not alone. I would see them sometimes, glimpses only. Movement at the edge of vision. The sound of footsteps that mimicked my own but were not my own. I was being followed, or perhaps guided. I understood by this point that the forest was patient. The forest was not hunting me. It was waiting for me to complete my own journey of understanding. It was waiting for me to arrive at the place where I would be ready for what came next. By September, the first anniversary of Natalie's disappearance, I had walked so far into the forest that I did not know how to return to the marked world. I did not try to return. Instead, I found a place, a clearing that seemed to have been waiting for me. The same clearing that appeared in Benjamin Brooks' journal. The same place where the light did not match the light of the ordinary world. And I waited. For 3 days, I waited. I did not sleep. I did not eat. I simply existed in the space between what I had been and what I was becoming. On the third night, they came. I saw them clearly for the first time. Multiple creatures, each distinct, each with a quality of presence that went far beyond physical form. They moved with an intelligence that was absolute. There was nothing animal about them. There was nothing of the monster about them. They were simply other, simply conscious in a way that was parallel to human consciousness but not similar to it. One of them approached me, the largest, the one that seemed to hold a position of significance among the group, and it communicated, not in words, not in language as I understood language, but through a direct transfer of meaning that bypassed speech entirely. It was understanding, downloaded directly into my consciousness. I understood things about the forest that I had never been able to articulate. I understood the intelligence that inhabited the trees and the soil. I understood the network of consciousness that extended below the surface, connecting every living thing in the ecosystem. I understood that what I perceived as separate creatures was actually one distributed intelligence, expressing itself through multiple forms. I understood that the treaty was real. It was a compact that had been established thousands of years ago between the Tlingit people and the intelligence of the forest. It was an agreement that humans would live in the forest without destroying it, without consuming it, without treating it as a resource to be exploited. In exchange, the forest would tolerate human presence. But the treaty had been broken. The government had come. The roads had been cut. The trees had been logged. The forest had been surveyed and marked and measured as though it were dead, inert matter to be managed and optimized. The creatures had been patient. They had tried communication. They had tried boundary setting. They had tried using language that humans could understand. But the government continued. The exploitation continued. The refusal to honor the treaty continued. So the creatures had escalated. Natalie had been the first warning. She had been taken to demonstrate that boundaries were real, that the forest was not merely a backdrop to human activity. Benjamin had been the second. He had been chosen and returned as a living proof that the creatures were intelligent, that they were capable of selective judgment, that they understood the difference between those who might listen and those who would not. Carol had been the third. She had been taken because she had understood. She had aligned herself with the forest's purpose. She was no longer Karen moving through the forest. She had become part of the forest itself, and I was the fourth. I had been chosen not to be returned, not to serve as proof, but to be transformed, to become a walker, to become a bridge between the human world and the world of the forest intelligence. The transformation began that night. It was not violent. It was not painful. It was instead a process of integration. The marks on my body began to glow. They moved beneath my skin like living things. They reorganized themselves into new patterns. And with each reorganization, my perception shifted. I could see in the dark as clearly as in daylight. I could hear sounds that I had never heard before, frequencies that existed at the edge of human perception. I could smell the history of the forest, could read the chemical signatures that told the stories of growth and decay and rebirth. But most importantly, I could think differently. My consciousness began to operate at a speed that was faster than human thought. I could perceive multiple timelines simultaneously. I could understand cause and effect not as sequence but as simultaneity. I was becoming something new. I was losing the capacity to be human while gaining the capacity to understand what it meant to live in genuine relationship with a conscious land. By dawn, the transformation was complete, and I was no longer the man who had entered the forest as a ranger. I was a walker. I understand now what Carol must have experienced. I understand why she did not return. Not because she could not, but because she had no desire to. The human world after this feels like a painting, something two-dimensional and artificial. How could anyone choose to return to that after experiencing this? The creatures. I know better than to call them creatures now, but human language requires nouns and categories, so I continue with the word because there is no better one. The creatures accepted me into their community with a kind of grace that human social structures could never achieve. I learned their territories. I learned the boundaries of their understanding, which extended far beyond the Tongass, connected to other forests, other wild places, through networks of communication that traveled faster than physical movement. I learned that they had been watching humanity for hundreds of years, trying different approaches to boundary maintenance, trying to find language that humans could understand. Most humans could not. Most humans would never arrive at the clearing in the forest. Most humans would never choose to submit to the transformation. Most humans would continue to move through the world, treating the land as an inert resource. But some humans could understand. Some humans could learn the language. Some humans could choose alignment with a consciousness beyond their own. I spent 6 months in the clearing. Or perhaps it was 6 weeks. Time moves differently when you are thinking at the frequency of forest intelligence. Days and nights cycle, but they do not feel sequential. They feel like parts of a larger pattern, an expression of rhythms that extend beyond the limitations of human chronology. During that time, I was given work. The creatures asked me to serve as a messenger, to go into the towns, to speak with people who might be capable of understanding, to share the message that the treaty still existed, that the boundaries still held, and that continued violation would result in continued escalation. I asked if I would be required to harm people. The creatures responded with something that was neither yes nor no, but a series of images that showed me what harm meant to them. They showed me forests dying from logging. They showed me ecosystems collapsing from mining and development. They showed me the slow suffocation of consciousness that occurred when the intelligence of the land was denied and disrupted. They showed me that what humans considered harm, physical injury, death, was of far less consequence than the harm they were already inflicting on the land itself. I was being asked not to harm people, but to awaken them to the harm they were already committing. It was a task I accepted without reservation. But first, before I could go into the towns, I had to understand the full extent of what was happening. The creatures took me deeper, deeper than the clearing, deeper into a part of the forest that I do not believe is fully part of the physical world as humans understand the physical world. There I witnessed things that I cannot translate into language. I saw the intelligence that inhabited the forest expressing itself through multiple scales simultaneously. I saw it in the fungal networks beneath the soil. I saw it in the movement of water through the ecosystem. I saw it in the migration patterns of birds and the communication between trees through root systems and chemical signals. All of it was one unified consciousness. All of it was the forest, aware and responsive and absolutely patient. And I understood in that moment that the creatures, the ones I had thought of as separate entities, were expressions of that consciousness. They were how the forest's intelligence manifested in a form that could interact with human perception. They were the forest's voice. And I had been chosen to carry that voice back into the human world. When they released me, it was with a message. The message was simple. The treaty would be honored. The forest would not allow further violation. Humans who chose to live within the boundaries would be left alone. Humans who chose to exploit the land would find themselves unable to complete their projects. Tools would fail. Workers would become ill. Circumstances would conspire to make continuation impossible. The forest did not hate humanity, but it would not allow itself to be destroyed in the name of human progress. And it would continue to choose humans. It would continue to identify those who could understand. It would continue the process of creating walkers, humans who existed between worlds, humans who could serve as bridges and as messengers. I left the clearing in late February. I walked out of the deep forest and back toward the human world. My marks had faded again, invisible now beneath my skin. To a casual observer, I was simply another man, aged and weathered by time in the wilderness. But I was also something else entirely. I came back to Juneau. I accessed the records I had sealed. I read about my own investigation, terminated for lack of evidence. I read about Carol Watson, still listed as missing, likely deceased. I read about the research team's report, filed and dismissed. I started writing. I started documenting. Not for the government, not for official channels, for anyone who might come after me, for anyone else who might be chosen, for the record that would eventually prove that this had happened, that this was still happening. The tourists still come to Juneau. The logging companies still plan their projects. The government still draws lines on maps that do not correspond to the boundaries of the forest's consciousness. But things are different now. The hiking trails where Natalie disappeared have become increasingly dangerous. Hikers report becoming lost despite clear markers. Trail conditions deteriorate inexplicably. Every project to expand or maintain access to the deep forest encounters delays and obstacles that cannot be explained by ordinary circumstances. And every few months, someone else goes missing. Sometimes they return. Sometimes they do not. But always, always, they were chosen. I am here now, in a cabin outside Juneau, writing this account. I do not know how long I can remain in the human world. The marks are becoming visible again. The forest is calling more loudly. But I have been given time to finish this, to bear witness, to provide documentation that the truth exists, even when the government denies it, even when science dismisses it, even when rational explanation fails. I understand now why Raymond Gray left, why Carol did not return, why Benjamin Brooks could not stay. Once you have walked in the clearing in the forest, once you have felt the consciousness that dwells in the trees and soil and water, once you have understood that you are part of something infinitely larger than yourself, you cannot return to the simplification of the human world. But someone must bear witness. Someone must tell the story. Someone must remain just enough in the human frame to make the record clear. So I write, and I wait, and I listen to the sounds in the forest, growing louder as the season turns toward autumn. The treaty is real. The boundaries are real. The forest is conscious, and it is patient, and it is absolutely capable of defending itself. Humanity has broken the agreement. The consequences are already beginning. Do you hear it? The sound of the forest calling. If you live in the wild places, if you have felt the pull of something vast and intelligent in the landscape, if you have sensed that the land is aware, you may have been chosen. And if you are chosen, you will have to make a decision. You can resist, like Natalie did. But resistance is futile. You can return, like Benjamin did. But you will never be free of what you learned. Or you can surrender, like Carol did, like I did. You can become a walker. You can serve as a bridge. You can understand that humans are not the dominant intelligence on this world. The forest is, and it is no longer asking for our respect. It is demanding it. The choice is yours, but choose quickly, because the marks are already on your skin. You can feel them, cannot you? The way they move beneath the surface, the way they reorganize when you are not paying attention. The forest is patient, but the forest is also hungry for those who might understand. Welcome to the clearing. Welcome to the Tongass. Welcome home.